Early on the evening of Sunday, the 27th of November, 2005, a 21-year-old woman named Catherine Woods was leaning towards the mirror in her small New York City apartment. She was carefully applying her eyeliner, her hands steady, a skill she'd perfected over countless nights just like this one. Her phone, sitting on the bathroom counter next to her makeup, buzzed. She heard it, but she didn't even glance over to see who was calling. She just didn't have the time. Her shift started at 7, and she couldn't afford to be late. Catherine had moved to the city from Ohio 3 years earlier. She had that big, bright dream that pulls so many people to New York. She wanted to be a dancer on Broadway. She imagined her name in lights, the roar of the crowd, the feeling of being on stage under the hot theatrical lights. But New York City is an expensive place to have a dream. Just existing here costs a fortune. So, in between chasing that Broadway dream, she was working. A lot. She actually had 3 different jobs just to keep her head above water, to pay the rent, and to afford the lessons she needed to even have a shot at her dream. 2 of her jobs were pretty normal. She was a waitress at a busy diner, where she was quick on her feet and had a friendly smile that earned her good tips. She also taught dance classes to little kids, their energy and enthusiasm a welcome contrast to the cynicism of the city. She loved seeing their faces light up when they nailed a new step. But tonight, she was getting ready for her 3rd job. And this job was different. It wasn't something she talked about. In fact, she was deeply embarrassed by it, and she kept it a secret from almost everyone she knew, especially her family back in Ohio. Her 3rd job was at a place near Times Square called Flash Dancers. She was a topless dancer. Catherine really, truly hated the work. The leering eyes, the fake smiles she had to put on, the way it made her feel. But the money was good. It was really good. And that money was the fuel for her dream. It paid for the expensive voice lessons and the advanced dance classes that were essential if she was ever going to make it to Broadway. She lived in Manhattan, the most expensive borough in an already incredibly expensive city. She knew she could save a lot of money if she moved to a cheaper neighborhood in a different borough like Queens or Brooklyn. And when she had first arrived in New York, that's exactly what she'd done. She'd found a small place in a less expensive area, thinking she was being smart and practical. But that practicality had come at a terrifying cost. Her landlord there had sexually assaulted her. The experience was so traumatic, so violating, that it nearly broke her. For a while, she seriously considered just giving up, packing her bags, and moving back home to Ohio, leaving the city and her dream behind forever. It felt like the city itself had chewed her up and spit her out. But in the end, after a lot of soul-searching, she decided to stay. She was a fighter. She wasn't going to let one horrible man destroy everything she had worked for. But she did make a change. She moved. She found her current apartment in a much safer part of Manhattan, where she felt she could walk down the street at night without constantly looking over her shoulder. To help with the much higher rent, she got a roommate. His name was David Hahn. He was 23, and he was a familiar face from back home in Ohio, a little piece of her old life in this new, overwhelming city. At this very moment, as Catherine was finishing her makeup, David wasn't in the apartment. He'd gone downstairs a few minutes ago to get his car, which was parked a few blocks away. He was going to drive her to her shift at the club. Catherine finished with her eyeliner, satisfied with the clean, sharp line. She left the bathroom and walked through the small living room. On the floor, a black dog was sleeping soundly. She had to step carefully over it. The dog wasn't hers, and it wasn't David's either. David was a part-time dog sitter. It was one of the many side jobs he juggled to make ends meet, just like her. This particular dog was just staying with them for a few days while its owners were out of town. When David wasn't dog sitting, he worked as a doorman at a fancy hotel just up the street from their apartment building. Catherine and David had a history that was a bit complicated. They had actually been a couple at one point. They dated for a little while after he followed her to New York. But these days, they were just friends, just roommates, splitting the bills to survive in the city. Although, if Catherine was being honest with herself, she sometimes wondered if they should give it another shot. Just a few days ago had been Thanksgiving. Instead of making the long trip back to Ohio like she usually did, she had stayed in New York and celebrated with David. Just the two of them. And it had been really nice. It felt comfortable, easy, like coming home. A big part of what she appreciated about him was that he knew about her job at Flash Dancers. He was one of the very few people who did, and he didn't judge her for it. He understood why she was doing it, and that lack of judgment was a rare and precious thing. But there was one major hurdle she could see if they were to ever get back together. It was David's attitude towards other men in her life. He seemed to dislike basically every single man she ever met or dated. It didn't matter who they were. He just had this immediate, almost instinctual distrust of them. Now, with some of the guys, she could kind of see his point. There was a guy named Joe she had dated for a short time. She had met him at the strip club. He was a customer. David had been very clear that he thought Joe was bad news. And in hindsight, he was probably right. But then there were other guys, like Paul. Paul was a personal trainer at her gym. She'd gone on a few dates with him, but it was nothing serious. They were more like friends who spoke on the phone every now and then. Paul had always been perfectly nice to David, polite and friendly whenever he saw him. But David still insisted that Paul was a creep. He just had a bad feeling about him. For now, though, Catherine pushed those thoughts aside. She didn't have time to sort out her entire romantic life. She just needed to get dressed and get downstairs before David started wondering where she was. She went into her bedroom, and that's when she heard it. The dog in the living room suddenly started barking. It wasn't a playful bark. It was sharp, insistent, like it was barking at something or someone. Curious, Catherine walked out of her bedroom to see what was going on. A little while later, David Hahn was walking quickly along the sidewalk, his breath misting in the cool November air. He was heading to his car, parked several blocks away from the apartment. He was already feeling a bit rushed. He finally reached the car, jumped in, and started the engine. He drove back towards his building, navigating the busy Sunday evening traffic. As he pulled up to the curb in front of his apartment, he took out his phone and called Catherine. He expected her to answer right away, to say she was on her way down. But the call went straight to voicemail. That was odd. He tried again. Voicemail again? He sighed, a little annoyed, and put his hazard lights on. He got out of the car and headed into the building to go get her. He took the stairs 2 at a time up to the second floor. As he turned down the hallway towards his apartment, he saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. There, standing right in the middle of the shared hallway, was the black dog he was supposed to be dog-sitting. Somehow, it had gotten out of the apartment. David just stared for a second, totally confused. Then he realized there was someone else there. His neighbor, a man named Brad Stewart, was standing right behind the dog. Brad was holding a leash, and it was clipped onto the dog's collar. Brad looked a bit surprised to see David, and David was just trying to process what was happening. Why did his neighbor have the dog on a leash in the hallway? Brad spoke first. He explained that he'd been coming up the stairs and had found the dog just wandering around by itself. He said he recognized it as David's dog, so he'd brought it back to their door. Brad said he had just knocked, but nobody had answered. At this point, David understood why Brad had the dog, but the bigger question was still unanswered. How did the dog get out in the first place? He didn't ask, though. He just thanked Brad, took the leash, and stepped over to the door of his apartment, number 2D. The door was closed, but when he tried the handle, he found that it was unlocked. He couldn't remember if he'd left it unlocked when he went to get the car. It wasn't something he would normally do. He pushed the door open and called out Catherine's name. There was no answer. Just silence. And that was really weird. She should have been right there, waiting for him. He stepped inside, the dog trailing behind him. He didn't see Catherine in the living room, but he did see that the door to her bedroom was slightly cracked open. He walked over to it and called her name again. Catherine, we're going to be late. Still nothing. He pushed on her door, expecting it to swing open. But it didn't. It moved maybe a few inches and then stopped hard. He could feel resistance from the other side, like something heavy was on the floor blocking the door from opening. And now, with all these strange little things piling up the dog in the hall, the unlocked door, the silence, the blocked bedroom door, a feeling of serious worry started to wash over him. A surge of adrenaline hit him, and he put his shoulder into the door and shoved it hard. It flew open. He stuck his head inside to see what was blocking it, and when his eyes adjusted to the light, what he saw made him recoil instantly. He pulled back, stumbled out of the room, ran back into the hallway, fumbling for his phone, and called the police. About a half an hour later, around 7:30 in the evening, an NYPD detective named Stephen Getz walked up the stairs of an apartment building in a nice part of Manhattan. This area was known for being extremely safe. Murders just didn't really happen here. But if the 911 call he'd just heard was accurate, he knew a potentially grisly murder scene was waiting for him in apartment 2D. When he got to the second-floor landing, he saw that a few other uniformed NYPD officers were already on the scene. One of them was talking to a young, skinny guy who was standing in the hallway looking completely distraught. The young man was holding a leash, and at the end of it was a black dog that was sitting quietly at his feet. Another officer saw Getz arrive and walked over to brief him. He said the man being interviewed was the victim's roommate, David Hahn. He was the one who had found the body and called 911. The victim, Catherine Woods, was inside the apartment, in the back bedroom. Getz nodded, his face grim, and walked down the hallway, past David and the dog, toward the open door of the apartment. His plan was always the same. He wanted to see the scene for himself before he started questioning anyone. Getz pulled on a pair of disposable rubber gloves and began his initial assessment. He carefully examined the doorframe of the apartment and then the door itself. He was looking for any signs of a break-in, any splintered wood or scratch marks around the lock. He saw nothing. No damage at all. That told him something important right away. Whoever did this either had a key or was let inside. He stepped into the apartment. The small living room was a little bit messy, but it was a lived-in messy, not a violent messy. The futon was pulled out into a bed, and there were some men's clothes strewn about. It just looked like a typical New York City apartment shared by young people. Getz moved slowly through the living room, taking care not to disturb anything. He headed towards the back of the apartment, towards what he assumed was the bedroom where the body was located. The door to the room was open just wide enough for him to slip through. When he stepped inside, the scene changed dramatically. There was blood everywhere. It was spattered on the walls, on the furniture. The room itself looked like a tornado had gone through it. It had been completely torn apart. A dresser drawer was hanging open, and women's clothing was scattered all over the floor. The mattress had been ripped completely off the bed frame and was now lying crookedly on the floor. That's what had been blocking the door from opening. And then, in the middle of all that chaos, in a large pool of blood, lay the body of a young woman. Getz knew from the 911 call that her name was Catherine Woods. He walked over and squatted down next to her for a closer look. She was wearing only a t-shirt and underwear. On the front of her t-shirt, he saw a very clear, distinct shoe print. It looked as if her killer had literally stepped on her chest during or after the attack. There were at least a dozen stab wounds all over her body. He also saw what he immediately recognized as defensive wounds on her hands and her forearms, little cuts and slices that told him she had fought back hard against her attacker. She had fought for her life. But the worst of her injuries were to her neck. Whoever had killed her had slit her throat with such savage force that they had nearly decapitated her. To Detective Getz, this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. This was an attack fueled by an absolute, uncontrollable rage. At that moment, Getz heard footsteps behind him. He stood up and turned around to see that the NYPD forensics team had arrived. The blocked door was making it difficult for people to move in and out of the bedroom, so one of the first things the forensics team did was to carefully pick up the mattress from the floor. They leaned it up against the wall, out of the way, so the bedroom door could now swing open freely. With the team now able to access the room properly, Detective Getz stepped back and let them do their work. He watched as they meticulously documented everything. He saw them carefully lift the shoe print from the t-shirt Catherine was wearing. Then they found a second, identical shoe print on her bedsheets, and they collected that one as well. To Getz, both of these prints looked like they came from the exact same shoe. And just by looking at them, he could tell they were made by a man's shoe, probably an average size. This immediately made Detective Getz curious about something. He stepped out of the bedroom and back into the living room. He quickly found a couple of pairs of men's shoes lying on the floor near the futon. He picked one up and looked at the sole. While the tread pattern didn't match the prints he had just seen in the bedroom, the size looked about right. They appeared to be the exact same size. An hour later, at about 8:30 that night, Detective Getz sat down at a metal table inside an interview room at the NYPD's 19th Precinct. He slid a bottle of water across the table to David Hahn, the roommate of the murder victim. And, at that moment, Detective Getz's number one suspect. The facts were simple and damning. There was no sign of forced entry at the apartment, which meant Catherine's killer either had access to the apartment or was led inside by someone who did. The murder weapon was a knife, and the sheer brutality of the attack screamed personal motivation. It felt like a crime of passion. Even though Catherine's bedroom had been completely trashed, nothing of value seemed to have been stolen. And because Catherine had been found partially undressed, a sexual motive was also a strong possibility. So Getz's working theory was that this murder was committed by a man who knew the victim well, had easy access to her home, and possibly had a romantic or sexual connection to her. David Hahn fit that profile perfectly. Plus, he apparently wore the same size shoe as the killer. Although, as Detective Getz settled into his chair and took out his notepad, he did a quick, subtle scan of David's hands and forearms. He saw no visible cuts, no scrapes, no bruises. That was a little strange. Getz figured that a fight as violent as the one Catherine had put up would have almost certainly left a mark on her attacker. But he didn't mention this to David. Instead, he just leaned forward, his expression sympathetic, and asked David to walk him through everything that had happened that day. David's hands were shaking a little as he reached for the water bottle. He took a deep breath to try and calm his nerves. He said he had been at the apartment with Catherine that night until about 6:40. That's when he left to go get his car so he could drive her to her 7 o'clock shift at Flash Dancers. But, he said, getting his car had taken longer than he expected. On the way, he had run into a couple of his coworkers from his doorman job, and he had stopped to chat with them for a few minutes. He said that after he finally got his car and drove back to the apartment, he had expected Catherine to be waiting for him out on the curb. But when he got there, she was nowhere in sight. She didn't answer her phone when he called, so he'd gone inside and run upstairs. In the hallway, he said, he had found his neighbor, Brad, who was for some reason holding the leash of the dog David was supposed to be watching. Then David said he went into the apartment, and that's when he found Catherine's body. He said he called 911 immediately and that it was right around 7 o'clock. As David said this, Getz stopped writing on his notepad and just looked up at him. He could not believe what he was hearing. David was claiming that he was only out of the apartment for 20 minutes, and in that tiny window of time, Catherine had been brutally murdered, and her killer had managed to escape without anyone seeing them. It was, honestly, one of the weakest alibis Getz had ever heard in his career. But he didn't let his skepticism show. He didn't want David to know just how close he was to being arrested, because he didn't want David to shut down and stop talking. So Getz kept his tone very calm and understanding as he asked how long David had known Catherine. David explained that they had met a few years ago back in Ohio while Catherine was home visiting family. They started dating, and he eventually decided to move to New York to be with her. But not long after he arrived, Catherine broke up with him, and she had asked him to move out of the apartment. David said he hadn't been able to afford a place of his own, so he had started sleeping in his car. He said Catherine had felt bad about that, and so she had eventually let him move back in, but on one condition, that he slept on the futon in the living room and that they were just roommates. By now, Detective Getz's pen was flying across the page. This new information was a bombshell. David wasn't just Catherine's roommate. He was her ex-boyfriend. A spurned ex-boyfriend who was the last person to see her alive and the first person to find her body. Getz was now more confident than ever that he was sitting across the table from Catherine's killer. He told David that everything he was saying was incredibly helpful. But he said he needed to go check on something really quick. David agreed to wait. As Getz stood up to leave, he stopped at the door and turned back. He asked David one last, seemingly casual question. He asked him what his shoe size was. Without a moment's hesitation, David answered that he wore a 10.5. Getz jotted this down on his notepad, and then he left the room. What he didn't tell David was that the reason he was stepping out was to get some crucial updates from the forensics team and from the uniformed officers who were, at that very moment, questioning David's neighbors. And once Getz had that information, he was going to come back and use it to try to catch David in a lie. About 19 hours later, around 3 in the afternoon the next day, Detective Getz was sitting at his desk, feeling completely exhausted. He was pounding yet another cup of bitter office coffee. He had been up all night long interrogating David, who was still, at that very moment, sitting in an interrogation room just down the hall. Getz had also been going back and forth with his team, getting updates from forensics and from officers out in the field, and he still had a mountain of paperwork to get through before he could even think about going home to sleep. Right now, he was going over a new batch of reports from the officers who had gone door to door in Catherine and David's apartment building, asking all the neighbors if they had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. And just as Getz had suspected, the information they were getting was starting to poke holes in David's story. David claimed that he had left the apartment at about 6:40 and that at that time, Catherine was perfectly fine. But 2 different neighbors reported hearing screams coming from that apartment well before 6:40. The man who lived in the unit directly above them said he had heard 3 distinct screams at exactly 6:28. And the people who lived in the apartment right next door to them said they'd heard screaming, a dog barking, and the sound of furniture being moved around even earlier, sometime between 5:45 and 6 o'clock. Now, none of these neighbors had called the police or done anything about the noises because the sounds had stopped pretty quickly. In a crowded New York City apartment building, strange noises were a part of life. And then there was Brad Stewart, the neighbor who had found the dog. Brad told police that when he ran into David in the hallway, it was sometime between 6 and 6:30. But David had insisted that he went back up to the apartment and found Catherine's body at about 7 o'clock, a full half hour later. Now, Getz knew from experience that witnesses were often unreliable when it came to specific times. And in a dense building, it was easy to get noises from different apartments confused. But still, all of these inconsistencies were adding up. It was looking more and more like David's alibi had serious problems. The detective sat back in his chair, took another sip of coffee, and then his phone rang. He picked it up. It was the forensics team, and they had an update on those shoe prints from the crime scene. They had confirmed that the prints on Catherine's t-shirt and on the bedsheets were indeed left by a man's shoe. They were a men's size, 10.5. This was the exact size David wore. Getz thanked them, hung up the phone, and then rushed back to the interrogation room for another chat with David Hahn. This time, though, Getz did not offer him a bottle of water. He just sat down, looked David straight in the eye, and confronted him with all the new evidence. He told David that the killer's shoe prints were exactly his size. He told him that his neighbors had heard screams coming from his apartment long before he claimed to have left the building. And he told him that Brad Stewart said he'd seen him in the hallway at least half an hour earlier than David had claimed. Getz then leaned in close and played his trump card. He told David that there were security cameras in the apartment building and that his officers were in the process of getting the footage right now. So, if David had anything to confess, he had better do it now, before the cameras proved he was lying. Getz watched as David's expression shifted from exhaustion to pure, raw fear. It seemed like this was the first time that David was truly realizing that the police did not believe his story for a second. After a moment of stunned silence, David insisted, his voice cracking, that he had not killed Catherine. He begged Getz to believe him. But when the detective just glared back at him, his face a mask of stone, David launched into a brand new story. It was a story he had not mentioned at all in the nearly 20 hours he had been interrogated. David said that Catherine knew this guy named Paul Cortez. He said she had dated him for a while, but that David had always thought he was a creep. David said Catherine had even told him that Paul was obsessed with her. So, David said, the police really needed to go investigate Paul, not him. To Detective Getz, this sounded like a desperate, last-ditch effort from a guilty man trying to cast suspicion on someone, anyone else. But he also knew that he had to follow up on every lead, no matter how flimsy it seemed. So he wrote down Paul's name and told David they would look into it. When Getz finally left the station for the evening, David was still in the interrogation room. And outside on the steps of the precinct, reporters from all the major newspapers were beginning to gather their cameras at the ready. The following morning, the story of Catherine's murder was everywhere. Pictures of her smiling face were on the front page of every paper in the city. The headline on the New York Daily News made Detective Getz grimace. It read, "Secret Life of Slain Stripper." The article inside reported that Catherine's family back in Ohio hadn't even known she was working as a topless dancer until they flew to New York to identify her body. Getz skimmed the article at his desk. He wasn't convinced that Catherine's line of work had anything to do with her murder, but the papers were determined to run with that angle. A media circus was the last thing he needed. His team was already under immense pressure to make an arrest, and now they were going to be flooded with tips from the public, most of which would be useless. Getz put down the newspaper, got up from his desk, and walked down the hall to an interrogation room. He had ended the day yesterday feeling pretty sure that David was his killer. He had finally sent David home, but with strict instructions not to leave the city. He fully intended to arrest David, and soon. But first, he had to do his due diligence. He had to follow up on the other leads he had, if only to definitively rule them out. And one of those leads was sitting in the interrogation room right now, waiting for him. It was Paul Cortez, the man David had named. Officers had tracked him down and brought him in for questioning. The man who was supposedly obsessed with Catherine. As soon as Getz entered the room, the first thing he did was subtly look down at Paul's shoes. He could see they were a pretty typical size, maybe a 10 or an 11. At a glance, they could easily be a 10.5. Getz also looked for any scratches or bruises on Paul's hands and arms. And he did see one small injury, a little cut on one of Paul's fingertips. Getz asked him about it. Paul explained calmly that his finger had just gotten pinched between a couple of weights at the gym where he worked as a trainer. Paul was very calm, very soft-spoken. He said he had heard about Catherine's death in the news, and he was devastated. He just wanted to help the investigation in any way he could. When Getz told him that they had gotten his name from David Hahn, Paul just kind of rolled his eyes. He said that David had always been jealous of his relationship with Catherine. Paul explained that he had met Catherine at the gym about a year ago, and they had been dating on and off ever since. He said that at the time of Catherine's death, they were in an off phase, but he still cared about her deeply and had hoped that one day they might get back together for good. Paul told Getz that he hadn't seen Catherine in person on the day she died, but he had spoken to her on the phone earlier that afternoon. He said this wasn't unusual. They still talked on the phone from time to time, even when they weren't officially together. Paul said he had actually tried to call her a second time later that day, but she didn't answer. He said he didn't think much of it at the time. Then Paul laid out his alibi for that night. He said he had gone shopping with some friends, and then later he went to a local bar to watch the Jets game, which started around 8:30. Getz made a note to check Paul's alibi. Then he asked Paul if he had any idea who might want to kill Catherine. Paul thought for a moment, and then his eyes seemed to light up, as if he'd just remembered something important. He said there was this other guy, a kind of stalker named Joe. He had been one of Catherine's regular customers at the strip club. He said that months ago, this guy Joe had somehow gotten Catherine's personal phone number and had started contacting her outside of the club. Paul said that around that same time, Catherine had been drugged at work. Someone had slipped a roofie, the date rape drug, into her drink during one of her shifts. Paul said that even though he could never prove it, he had always suspected that it was Joe who had drugged her. He said Catherine had eventually cut off all contact with Joe, but the whole incident had really bothered Paul. It bothered him so much that he had tried to convince Catherine to quit her job at the club, but she had refused. Paul even admitted that he had gone so far as to call Catherine's father in Ohio to tell him how worried he was about her. He said Catherine had been furious with him for doing that and had stopped talking to him for weeks. Getz jotted all of this down. Then he asked Paul if he knew how to get in touch with this Joe. Paul said he didn't have Joe's number, but he was sure it was in Catherine's phone. Because he said the very last time he spoke to Catherine on the phone, on the afternoon of her death, she had mentioned something that had really surprised him. She said that after months and months of silence, Joe had started calling her again, completely out of the blue. At this, Getz studied Paul's face, searching for any sign that he was lying. This whole story about Joe could just be a clever way for Paul to deflect suspicion from himself. But Paul seemed sincere. It didn't feel like he was making it up. And besides, it would be simple enough to verify his story by checking Catherine's phone records. Detective Getz hated to admit it, but maybe the newspapers were right. Maybe it was time he started looking seriously into some of the customers from Catherine's secret life at the strip club. The following afternoon, on Wednesday, November 30th, Detective Getz was feeling deeply annoyed as he hung up the phone at his desk. It had been another call from another reporter demanding an update on the case. But Getz had no updates to give. He hadn't made an arrest yet, so he was staying tight-lipped. For now, he just turned his focus back to the stack of papers on his desk. They were Catherine's cell phone records, which he had subpoenaed the day before. And they showed that Paul Cortez had been telling the truth. The records confirmed that both Paul and a man named Joe had called Catherine shortly before she was killed. So, Getz had his officers track down Joe and bring him in for an interview. He asked Joe to explain why, after months of no contact, he had suddenly decided to call Catherine on the very day she was murdered. Joe claimed he was just calling to check in, to say he hoped she had a nice Thanksgiving. He insisted he was just trying to be friendly. But then, Getz asked Joe point blank if he had ever put a roofie in anyone's drink. At this question, Joe's eyes went wide. He started to stammer and sputter, and he swore that he would never, ever dream of doing something like that. But based on Joe's panicked reaction, Getz had a strong feeling that he was lying. And so now, the entire investigation felt like it was wide open again. Just a few days ago, Getz had been absolutely certain that David Hahn was the killer. But now, all these other men from Catherine's life just kept coming out of the woodwork. He now had 3 main suspects instead of just one. In fact, at this point, his original suspect, David, was actually starting to look more innocent. Getz's officers had spoken to David's coworkers from the hotel, and they confirmed his story. They said he really had stopped to talk with them on the street on the evening of Catherine's death, just like he had claimed. And while Getz had hoped that the security camera footage from the apartment building would definitively prove David was lying about his timeline, it actually did the opposite. The footage showed David leaving the front entrance of the building at 6:38, which lined up perfectly with his story that he left around 6:40. Now, this didn't completely exonerate him. Based on what the neighbors had heard, Catherine could have been killed before he left. But there weren't many cameras in the old building, and there was no camera covering the second-floor hallway outside of apartment 2D. So the footage couldn't prove one way or another who, if anyone, had gone into that apartment while David was gone. Just then, his phone rang again. Getz reached for it, expecting it to be another reporter. But this time, he was pleasantly surprised. It was a member of the forensics team, and he could hear the excitement in their voice. They told Getz that they had just discovered something big, something they had completely missed during their first sweep of Catherine's apartment. The forensics tech explained that when they had first entered Catherine's bedroom, they had taken that mattress that was blocking the door and propped it up against the wall to get it out of the way. But when they had done that, the mattress had accidentally covered up a crucial piece of evidence that was on the wall the whole time. It was a bloody handprint. It wasn't until a couple of days later, after they had carefully gone over everything else in the room, that they finally moved the mattress back down onto the floor. And that's when they saw it. Getz's face lit up when he heard this news. This was the break he had been waiting for. Now he thought all he had to do was go get handprints from all three of his suspects and see which one matched. It seemed like it would be that simple. But he quickly realized he had a major problem. By this point, some of his suspects had already gotten lawyers. And their lawyers were advising them not to speak with the police anymore, let alone voluntarily hand over their handprints. And Getz couldn't legally force them to give their prints unless he arrested them first. And so, Detective Getz found himself in a frustrating catch, 2-2. He needed the suspect's handprint in order to make an arrest, but he couldn't get the handprint unless he arrested them. So at this point, the investigation stalled. Weeks went by. Detective Getz grew more and more frustrated because there was nothing he could legally do to push the case forward. Meanwhile, the case was still getting a ton of coverage in the press. And to the public, it looked like the NYPD was just dropping the ball. But then, on December 16th, 3 weeks after Catherine's murder, the very news coverage that had annoyed Getz so much ended up giving him exactly what he needed. That day, a woman called the NYPD because of something she had seen on the front page of a New York newspaper. And what this woman told them led Detective Getz directly to Catherine's killer. Based on all the forensic evidence and the numerous interviews police conducted, this is what they believe happened to Catherine Woods on the evening of the 27th of November, 2005. Shortly after 6:40 in the evening, the killer climbed the stairs inside Catherine's apartment building. They knew that at that very moment, she would be alone in the apartment, getting ready for another shift at Flash Dancers. The fact that she worked there, that she had this secret life, bothered the killer more than they ever let on. The thought of Catherine dancing for other men, giving her attention to other men, filled the killer with a jealous rage they could barely contain. The killer had tried to win her over, had tried to talk her into being with them exclusively, but she had rejected him. So, in the killer's mind, the time for talking was over. And so, the killer walked quietly up to the door of apartment 2D. They reached down and turned the handle. It was unlocked. As they slipped silently into the apartment, the killer pulled out the knife that they had hidden inside their sweatshirt. But then, something they had not planned for happened. The black dog that was lying on the apartment floor jumped up and began to bark at them. For a split second, the killer thought about just turning around and leaving, abandoning the plan. But then, Catherine, alerted by the dog's barking, came out of her bedroom. She looked right at the killer, and she saw the knife in their hand. Catherine screamed and turned and ran right back into her bedroom, the very bedroom that she had made explicitly off-limits to the killer in the past. And just the thought of that, of her trying to keep him out of her space, sent a surge of pure anger through them. The killer charged into the room after her. Catherine was already on the other side of the bed, trying to lift up the heavy mattress to use it as a shield. But the killer was too strong and too fast. They forced their way past the mattress and grabbed Catherine from behind. But Catherine was a fighter. She fought back with everything she had. She began thrashing and kicking, scratching and biting, doing anything she could to break free. But she couldn't. They struggled wildly around the small room, smashing into furniture, knocking things over. And it was around this point that the killer lifted up the knife they had brought and slit her neck as deep as they could. But even then, even with that fatal wound, Catherine kept fighting. She fought with such viciousness that the killer actually had to brace themselves against the wall just to keep their balance. And in the chaos of that struggle, the killer didn't even realize that as they steadied themselves, they had placed their bloody hand flat against the wall, leaving a perfect print behind. Finally, Catherine fell to the floor. but the killer was still blinded by rage. They got down on the floor with her and began stabbing her over and over and over again. And then finally, when Catherine stopped moving, the killer jumped up and ran out of the apartment. But when they got into the hallway, they realized that the black dog that had barked at them had gotten out of the apartment during the chaos. Now, the killer wanted the dog to be back inside the apartment, but the dog was on edge, still barking at them. So instead, the killer just pulled the apartment door shut, trapping the dog out in the hallway. And then the killer fled the building, using a back door where there was no security camera. And for weeks, the killer was not caught, until their violent past finally came back to haunt them. Several weeks after Catherine's murder, a young woman who had no connection to Catherine at all was walking down a street in New York City when she glanced over at a newsstand. And on the cover of one of the newspapers, a picture was plastered across the front page. It was a picture of a man who was currently a person of interest in a high-profile murder case. And this woman was horrified because she knew this man, the killer, had sexually assaulted her about a year earlier, but she had been too scared and ashamed to ever file a police report. But now, seeing his face in the paper, seeing that this horrible person was being investigated for murder, she knew she had to speak up. She called the NYPD and she told them everything she knew. The NYPD's Special Victims Unit used this woman's brave testimony as the basis to arrest the killer for the previous assault. And finally, once he was under arrest, Detective Getz was legally able to get his handprint. And those prints were a perfect match to the bloody handprint found on Catherine's bedroom wall. They belonged to Catherine's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Paul Cortez. David's suspicions about Paul had been right all along. Paul was a creep, a violent predator who had assaulted at least one other woman before he murdered Catherine. Data collected from nearby cell phone towers would later prove that Paul was in the immediate vicinity of Catherine's apartment building right before her murder. The records also showed he had been calling her over and over again. When she ignored his calls, Paul waited. He watched until he saw David leave the apartment to go get his car. And then he hustled upstairs, knowing that Catherine would be alone. Even though David was only gone for about 20 minutes, it was more than enough time for Paul to get inside the apartment, murder Catherine in a jealous rage, and slip away completely unnoticed. Paul Cortez was arrested about a month after Catherine's murder on Wednesday, the 23rd of December, 2005. He was later found guilty of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. And just like that, the truth finally came to light. But the haunting question remains, how many stories like this are still unresolved, hidden from view? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you're not ready to stop here, there's still so much waiting for you in the next episode. See you next time. In the brisk chill of early 1986, the campus of the University of Missouri was filled with the anxious, excited energy of graduating seniors. Among them walked William, a 22-year-old young man who, on paper, had a perfectly mapped-out future. He was a journalism major, just a few months away from earning his degree from one of the most prestigious journalism schools in the country. A degree from this institution was a golden ticket to a stable career, but William was deeply unhappy. He realized he had absolutely no passion for news reporting, and the thought of spending his life in a traditional newsroom left him feeling empty. His true passion lay in Hollywood movies. Having lived in Missouri his entire life, William considered himself a sheltered kid who had never traveled far from home. To him, the local movie theater was a magical portal. It transported him to exotic lands, introduced him to fascinating characters, and showed him a world far bigger than his Midwestern surroundings. As graduation loomed, William faced a stark truth. If he didn't make a move now, he would spend his life living someone else's dream. Weeks before receiving his degree, he shocked everyone by dropping out of college, packing his bags into a beat-up car, and driving straight to Los Angeles to become an actor. When he arrived in Hollywood, his naive optimism was instantly met with a harsh reality. William quickly discovered that the streets of Los Angeles were overflowing with thousands of young, attractive, and ambitious people who shared his exact dream. The competition was brutal, with hundreds of actors lining up for even the smallest roles. However, his Midwestern work ethic kept him going. He found a talent agent and began auditioning constantly, willing to take any part, whether it was a low-budget horror film or a simple commercial, just to get in front of a camera. Yet, the industry remained indifferent, and he faced rejection after rejection. While he had the mental strength to handle the rejection, he could not escape his financial reality. Los Angeles was expensive, and his savings were rapidly disappearing. Because he needed to keep his daytime hours open for sudden auditions, he could only take side gigs that operated late at night or early in the morning. Since the city's struggling actors had already taken all the decent part-time jobs, William was left with the bottom-of-the-barrel work that nobody else wanted. To survive, he took two incredibly bizarre jobs. During the day, he worked for a fast food restaurant called El Pollo Loco. His job was to wear a massive, suffocatingly hot yellow chicken suit, stand out on the scorching pavement of Sunset Boulevard, and wave at traffic to lure in customers. It was exhausting and humiliating work. When the sun went down, he transitioned to his night job as a limousine driver for a group of exotic dancers who performed at private bachelor parties. He wasn't just a driver. He also had to enter the venues to act as their bodyguard, manage the music as a mobile DJ, and eventually clean up the cash and scattered clothing left behind before driving the exhausted dancers home at dawn. Initially, William accepted this chaotic life as a temporary rite of passage. But as the months dragged on, the struggling artist romanticism faded. The big break wasn't happening, and the low pay forced him to work grueling hours just to survive, leaving him little time to rehearse or rest. Caught in a miserable cycle of exhaustion and constant rejection, he reached a breaking point. William decided to quit the limousine job, keep the chicken suit gig for stability, and give himself one final, concentrated push. If things didn't change soon, he would pack up his car and move back to Missouri. On his final night driving the limousine, William struck up a conversation with one of the dancers. Like him, she was an aspiring actress using stripping to fund her dream. When William explained that he was simply going to as many open auditions as possible, she told him he was doing it wrong. She recommended a highly exclusive, prestigious acting class in the city where top talent scouts frequently went to look for new faces. She urged him to stop just auditioning and start training. Though William initially dismissed the idea, thinking he didn't have time for theory, he looked at his long streak of failures and decided he had nothing to lose. He agreed to attend just one session. A few days later, William walked into the acting studio. The instructor began pairing students up randomly to perform scenes live in front of the class. When William's name was called, he was paired with another young actor. However, the stakes for this particular scene were incredibly high. The other actor had invited major Hollywood talent agents to this specific class to watch him perform, hoping to get signed. William understood that he was only there to play a supporting role and read lines so his classmate could shine. He felt no pressure and was content to just help out. The two actors stepped onto the stage under the spotlight. The other actor delivered his lines exactly as rehearsed. But when it was William's turn to respond, something inside him shifted. All the months of frustration, the humiliation of the chicken suit, the late nights in the limousine, and the pain of 100 rejections broke through his quiet exterior. He didn't just read the script, he completely lived it. William's performance was electric. He delivered his lines with a raw, magnetic vulnerability and an emotional intensity that completely captivated the room. The spotlight instantly shifted. William didn't just support his partner, he completely overshadowed him. He brought a rare, natural charisma to the stage that commanded absolute attention. When the scene ended, the room was dead silent before bursting into thunderous applause. The talent agents ignored the actor they had originally come to see, walked straight up to William, and signed him on the spot. Word quickly spread through Hollywood about the incredibly talented unknown actor from Missouri who had stolen the spotlight in a high-stakes showcase. The momentum was unstoppable. William took off the chicken suit for good and never had to drive a limousine again. He began booking roles left and right, quickly rising from small parts to leading roles in massive global blockbusters. Today, the world no longer calls him William. Instead, he is known globally by his middle name, an international cinema icon, Academy Award winner, and one of the most celebrated movie stars to ever live, Brad Pitt. And the early fragile days of April 1945. The small town of Velp in the German-occupied Netherlands was locked in a state of suspended animation. The air was heavy, with the smell of smoke, damp earth, and the unmistakable, lingering scent of fear. Inside the cramped, shadow-filled basement of a modest brick house belonging to her aunt, a 15-year-old girl named Ada lay curled on a makeshift pile of faded wool blankets. Her stomach did not just rumble, it burned with a deep, gnawing agony that felt as though her body was slowly consuming itself from the inside out. Ada felt a profound, heavy weakness in her limbs, a lethargy so absolute that even shifting her weight across the floor required a monumental effort of will. She was quite literally standing on the precipice of starvation. At 5 feet 6 inches tall, a height that should have belonged to a developing, energetic young woman, Ada's weight had plummeted to a terrifying 88 pounds. Her collarbones protruded like sharp ridges beneath her threadbare clothes. Her skin was a translucent, sickly gray, and her eyes were sunken deep into her skull. She could no longer walk. She could no longer stand. When she tried to look at her mother, who sat silently in the dim light nearby, Ada found she could barely summon the strength to articulate basic words. Her voice had degraded to a dry, raspy whisper. To anyone looking at her, the reality was brutally clear. Without a miracle, the young girl was within a few days, perhaps even hours, of dying. The tragedy of the situation was compounded by the fact that she was not alone in her suffering. Surrounding her in the damp basement were her mother, her aunt, and a desperate group of refugees whom her family had bravely taken in. They sat shoulder to shoulder in the dark, their faces hollow, their own bodies wasting away. They watched Etta fade with breaking hearts, yet there was absolutely nothing they could do. There was no secret stash of bread, no hidden sack of potatoes, and no medicine to soothe her failing organs. The entire household, like millions of others across the Netherlands, had run out of food weeks ago. To make this nightmare even more unbearable, the basement was not just a shelter from hunger, it was a prison. Ada, her family, and the refugees had been completely trapped beneath the floorboards for months. Stepping outside into the daylight was not an option. It was an automatic death sentence. Outside, the closing chapters of World War II were raging across the Dutch countryside with apocalyptic fury. The town of Velp had become a chaotic battleground as the retreating Nazi forces clashed with the advancing Allied armies. Day and night, the ground above the basement trembled. Artillery shells screamed through the air, bombs shattered nearby homes into rivers of brick and dust, and the sharp, rhythmic crackle of machine gun fire echoed down the streets. To venture out in search of a stray turnip or a cup of clean water meant risking a stray bullet or being obliterated by falling debris. They were entirely cornered, caught between the invisible specter of starvation inside and the violent inferno outside. It had not always been this way. 5 years earlier, before the darkness of the war completely swallowed her world, the Netherlands had been a place of color and music for Ada. When the Nazi regime first invaded and occupied her homeland in 1940, she had been a vibrant, joyful 11-year-old girl. She was blessed with an abundance of natural grace and possessed a singular burning dream. She wanted to become a professional, world-class ballet dancer. She lived for the stage, spending hours practicing her postures, her leaps, and her turns. Because she was so young when the gray uniformed soldiers first marched into her town, she didn't fully comprehend the geopolitical catastrophe unfolding around her. To a child, the occupation was an uncomfortable nuisance, a shadow that dimmed the lights but hadn't yet destroyed the house. That childhood innocence shattered completely when the reality of Nazi brutality struck her own family. Ada's uncle was a prominent, highly respected Dutch count and an outspoken anti-Nazi activist. He refused to sit idly by while his country was subjugated. Eventually, his underground activities were discovered by the Gestapo. He was arrested, imprisoned, and, without a fair trial, executed by a Nazi firing squad. The murder of her beloved uncle acted as a profound catalyst for Ada. The grief twisted into a fierce, unyielding determination. She looked at the world around her with newly opened eyes and realized that she could not remain a passive bystander while an oppressive regime tore her country apart. Despite her youth, she chose to fight back. Ada threw herself into the dangerous, secretive world of the Dutch resistance. She realized that her training as a ballerina could be used as a weapon against the occupiers. She began performing in covert underground ballet recitals held in darkened basements and hidden rooms across the region. These events, known as blackout performances, were strictly illegal. The audiences sat in absolute silence, never clapping for fear of alerting the German patrols patrolling the streets outside. The money raised from these hushed recitals was funneled directly into the resistance movement to forge documents, buy supplies, and finance underground operations. But Ada did not stop at dancing. Her innocent, youthful appearance made her the perfect courier. She routinely volunteered to smuggle illegal resistance newspapers, tightly folding the forbidden print and hiding it inside her ballet slippers or the linings of her coats. She rode her bicycle across town, navigating past German checkpoints with a calm, smiling demeanor that masked a racing heart. She knew that if a single soldier decided to search her bags, she would be executed on the spot. As the war intensified, her defiance grew. She successfully convinced her mother and aunt to convert their home into a safe house, taking in and concealing Jewish refugees and downed Allied pilots, hiding them beneath the very floorboards where she now lay dying. Every day was a high-stakes game of survival, but it gave Ada an intense sense of purpose. She was no longer just a helpless girl caught in a war, she was a participant, actively striking blows against tyranny. Then came the catastrophic winter of 1944. Following a major Allied airborne operation known as Market Garden, the Dutch railway workers went on strike to cripple the German military's movements. In a fit of cruel retaliation, the Nazi administration completely blocked all food and fuel transports into the western and northern parts of the Netherlands. This triggered what would forever be remembered as the Hunger Winter. Virtually overnight, supply lines died. A nation was cut off from the world. As the temperatures plummeted below freezing, millions of Dutch citizens found themselves without electricity, running water, heat, or food. People resorted to eating tulip bulbs and boiling grass just to trick their stomachs into feeling full. As the months wore on, the humanitarian crisis deepened into a catastrophe. For Ada, the physical toll was devastating. The intense physical exertion of her resistance work, combined with a total lack of nutrition, caused her health to fracture. Her body, already pushed to its absolute limits, began to shut down. The vibrant ballerina who used to leap effortlessly across stages became too weak to carry a newspaper. Her resistance work came to an abrupt, forced end. She could no longer fight. She could no longer aid the refugees. All she could do was retreat into the dark safety of the basement, lie down on the cold floor, and watch her own body waste away to skin and bone. On that particular fateful day in early April 1945, the noise above the basement reached a terrifying crescendo. Ada lay in the dark, her chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged gasps. The air was thick with dust shaken loose from the ceiling by the constant vibrations of war. The symphony of destruction outside was deafening, the roar of low-flying fighter planes, the sharp thud of anti-aircraft guns, and the wailing of air raid sirens. It felt as though the entire world above them was being ground into dust. In her extreme weakness, feeling the icy pull of death creeping into her fingers, Ada closed her eyes and offered a silent, desperate prayer to God for help, for food, for an end to the madness. The immediate response to her prayer was a terrifying, high-pitched whistling sound that cut through the ambient roar of the battle. It was a sound that everyone in wartime Europe knew and feared. It was the sound of a falling bomb, and it was coming straight for them. Before anyone in the basement could scream, a deafening blast shattered the atmosphere. The impact was monumental. The floor beneath them violently bucked, throwing debris into the air. Concrete cracked, the remaining glass windows upstairs shattered into a million lethal shards, and a choking cloud of black smoke and plaster dust enveloped the room. The shockwave tore through Ada's frail body, and within seconds, the world dissolved into total, silent blackness. Sometime later, hours, perhaps even days, for time loses all meaning in the dark, Ada slowly regained consciousness. She coughed weakly, her throat choked with fine white plaster dust. Her ears were ringing with a loud, piercing static. As the dust slowly settled and her vision cleared in the dim light, she looked around, fully expecting to see a scene of carnage. But as she took inventory of the dark space, she witnessed an absolute miracle. Despite the bomb scoring an incredibly close, near-direct hit on the house above, the ancient stone foundations of the basement's structural integrity had somehow held. The heavy wooden beams had groaned and cracked, but they had not collapsed. She looked at her mother, her aunt, and the refugees. They were covered in white dust, bruised and terrified, but they were all alive. Yet, Ada did not feel a rush of relief. Instead, a profound sense of despair washed over her. She knew that surviving the blast was only a temporary reprieve. The house above them was likely ruined. They were still starving, she was still too weak to move, and the German soldiers were likely closing in. She believed this explosion was simply the beginning of the end. However, as she lay there, waiting for the next bomb to fall, she noticed something highly unusual. For months, the background track of her life had been an unbroken wall of noise, guns, engines, screams, and explosions. But right now, as she listened intently, the world was completely devoid of sound. The silence was heavy, profound, and absolute. There were no planes overhead. There were no artillery shells shaking the earth. There was no gunfire echoing down the cobblestone streets. The violent storm that had raged for years had suddenly, inexplicably, vanished. An uneasy, confused quiet fell over the refugees and her family. They exchanged panicked, uncomprehending glances. Was this a trap? Was the enemy waiting outside? Eventually, the agonizing silence pushed them to action. Driven by a desperate need to know what had happened, Ida's mother walked over to her daughter. Gathering her own remaining strength, she carefully lifted Ida's frail 88-pound frame into her arms, cradling her like a child. Together, the small group of survivors slowly walked up the debris-strewn basement stairs and stepped out into the open air for the first time in months. When their eyes adjusted to the bright morning sunlight, the sight that met them was overwhelming. The streets of Velp were not filled with gray Nazi uniforms. Instead, they were lined with British and Canadian Allied soldiers, their tanks and military trucks painted with white stars. The local Dutch townspeople, who had been hiding in their own cellars, were pouring out into the thoroughfares. People were weeping openly, falling to their knees, throwing their arms around the soldiers and waving red, white, and blue Dutch flags that had been hidden away for 5 long years. Voices shouted through the streets, carrying a single, beautiful realization. It's over. We are free! Allied soldiers had successfully liberated the city. The German occupation was broken. As Ada watched the celebration from her mother's arms, the timing of it all struck her with immense weight. If that Allied bomb had struck just a few feet to the left, her family would have been crushed. If the war had dragged on for just 48 hours longer, her malnourished body would have given up, and she would have died a nameless casualty in that dark cellar. Against all mathematical odds, she had survived to see the dawn of freedom. Within weeks of Velp's liberation, the Allied forces systematically dismantled the remaining Nazi strongholds across Europe. Germany surrendered, and World War II came to an official end. The world began the long, painful process of healing, and so did Ada. The physical scars of the war, however, ran deep. Although she was slowly nursed back to health with the help of international relief organizations, the prolonged period of severe starvation and the injuries she sustained during the occupation had done permanent damage to her body. Her respiratory system was compromised, and her muscle development had been severely disrupted during crucial years of growth. When she finally returned to the dance studio, she had to face a heartbreaking reality. Her body could no longer handle the extreme, punishing demands of a professional, full-time prima ballerina. Her childhood dream was dead. But the spirit that had carried her through the Dutch resistance refused to be crushed. Realizing that one path was closed, she pivoted with grace. She began taking jobs as a fashion model to support her family, her striking aristocratic features and slender frame catching the eyes of photographers. Soon after, she tried her hand at acting, finding that the intense discipline, emotional depth, and poise she had developed during the terrifying years of the war translated beautifully to the stage and screen. She eventually left Europe behind and moved to the United States, targeting the heart of the entertainment world, Hollywood. In 1953, a mere 8 years after she had been a starving, skeletal 15-year-old girl waiting for death in a dusty Dutch basement, she was cast as the lead actress in a romantic comedy called Roman Holiday. Playing opposite Gregory Peck, her performance captured the hearts of audiences worldwide. She exuded a rare, luminous charm, a quiet strength, and an unmistakable elegance that set her completely apart from the typical Hollywood stars of the era. The film was a triumph, and for her very first major role, she won the Academy Award for Best Actress. The horrors of World War II had taken an immense toll on her life. It had stolen her uncle, threatened her family, and destroyed her ultimate dream of ballet. Yet, the brutal crucible of the war had also gifted her with a profound empathy, an unbreakable resilience, and a deep appreciation for the fragility of human life. These qualities not only made her one of the most successful, iconic, and revered actresses in the history of cinema, but they also guided her later years, during which she stepped away from the cameras to travel the world as a deeply dedicated UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, fighting to save starving children in war-torn regions just as she had been saved. When she achieved global fame, she chose to leave her childhood nickname Ada in the past. Instead, the world came to know her by the name that remains synonymous with grace, timeless beauty, and humanitarian devotion, Audrey Hepburn. On a humid morning in the summer of 1889, a 36-year-old surgeon named Dr. William Halstead stood in an operating prep room at the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. Standing beside him was his 27-year-old head nurse, Caroline Hampton. They were preparing for an upcoming surgery, but before Dr. Halstead would even think about picking up a scalpel, he had to watch Caroline complete a grueling ritual. Caroline stood before a row of porcelain sinks filled with various liquids. First, she scrubbed her hands and forearms with scalding hot water and heavy-duty antibacterial soap. Next, she used harsh brushes and metal files to clean beneath her fingernails. Then came the painful part. She dipped her bare hands directly into a bowl of harsh acid, followed by a 5-minute soak in a highly corrosive chemical solution called mercury bichloride. Dr. Halstead ran a remarkably tight ship, especially when it came to hand hygiene. Today, we know that washing our hands before medical procedures is common sense, but in 1889, it was a radical and highly controversial concept. At the time, germ theory, the idea that microscopic organisms cause diseases and infections, was brand new. Most doctors flatly rejected it. Surgeons would routinely walk from an autopsy room straight into a delivery room without washing their hands or cleaning their tools, completely unaware that they were carrying deadly bacteria to their patients. Dr. Halstead, however, was a firm believer in germ theory. He was obsessed with cleanliness, which is why he created this brutal multi-step scrubbing routine for his surgical team. While other hospitals across the United States suffered from terrifyingly high post-surgery infection rates, Dr. Halstead's department boasted some of the lowest mortality rates in the country. His methods worked beautifully, but they came at a severe physical cost to his staff. The chemicals they used were toxic, eating away at human skin day after day. On this particular morning, as doctor, Halstead watched Caroline let her hands air dry. He noticed just how badly she was hurting. Her hands and forearms were covered in angry red blisters, raw rashes, and painful cracked skin. It was a terrible sight, and Dr. Halstead felt a deep pang of guilt. He felt guilty for two reasons. First, Caroline was an incredible worker. Despite the immense pain the daily chemical baths caused her, she never once complained. She followed his strict rules flawlessly, which was exactly why he had promoted her to head nurse. She possessed an iron will and a profound dedication to her job. But the second, much deeper reason for his guilt was a secret he kept buried in his heart. Dr. Halstead was madly in love with Caroline. He had never told her how he felt. He believed he was too old for her, and he assumed a brilliant, capable woman like Caroline would never be interested in a serious, work-obsessed surgeon like himself. So he loved her from afar, keeping his feelings strictly professional while remaining intensely protective of her. Watching the woman he secretly adored destroy her skin every day just to satisfy his protocols was tearing him apart. For the first time, Dr. Halstead began to question his own system. He desperately wanted to tell Caroline that she could skip the chemical scrub to let her hands heal, but he was trapped by his own reputation. He was the leading champion of germ theory in America. If he made a special exception for his head nurse, word would spread, his credibility would be ruined, and his staff would stop taking the hygiene rules seriously. He needed a workaround, a solution that would protect Caroline's hands without compromising the sterile environment of his operating room. Months passed, and as the calendar turned to early 1890, Dr. Halstead sat alone in his office. On his desk lay a small, neatly wrapped package that had just arrived. He looked at it with a mixture of nervous anticipation and intense hope. For nearly a year, he had been trying to solve his dilemma. Finally, he had come up with an out-of-the-box idea and reached out to the Goodyear Rubber Company to see if they could manufacture a highly specific prototype. Dr. Halstead tore open the package. Inside were two strange, thin, flexible objects made of dark, vulcanized rubber. Without wasting a single second, he grabbed them, hurried out of his office, and marched down the hallway to the operating prep room. As expected, he found Caroline standing by the sinks, lifting her raw, blistered hands to begin the agonizing scrubbing process. Dr. Halstead stepped forward and gently stopped her. He held out the two rubber objects and told her to put them on instead of dipping her hands into the chemicals. Caroline looked at the strange items, looked at her bleeding hands, and with a confused but trusting nod, pulled them over her fingers. Within just 1 week, the results were undeniable. Because the rubber acted as an impenetrable barrier, Caroline no longer had to plunge her bare skin into corrosive acids. Her hands and forearms healed beautifully, returning to their natural, healthy state. Seeing Caroline out of pain gave Dr. Halstead a massive surge of confidence. The joy of seeing her heal finally gave him the courage to break his silence. He confessed his deep love to Caroline, and to his absolute amazement, she revealed that she had been secretly in love with him too. Not long after, Dr. Halstead asked for her hand in marriage, and she happily said yes. While their love story was beautiful, it was the clever workaround Dr. Halstead invented out of love that would echo through history. Initially, he had only commissioned those rubber coverings to protect his fiancée's skin. But very quickly, Dr. Halstead and the rest of the Johns Hopkins medical team noticed a fascinating side effect. The patients Caroline operated on had even fewer post-surgery infections than before. The medical community realized that these rubber barriers didn't just protect the nurse's skin from chemicals, they also protected the patient from any stray germs remaining on a human hand. Soon, every surgeon, nurse, and doctor across the globe adopted the practice. Because a brilliant doctor fell deeply in love with his head nurse, he inadvertently created one of the most widely used and life-saving medical tools in human history, the world's very first pair of rubber surgical gloves. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. For nearly 10 years, a brutal murder sat unsolved, not because there were no suspects, not because there were no clues, but because the most important piece of evidence was misunderstood. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't lost. It was right there in plain sight. And when investigators finally realized what it meant, it didn't just point to a killer, it exposed something far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. But it would take nearly a decade and the help of a secretive group of elite crime solvers to finally see it for what it really was. If you're drawn to stories that are strange, dark, and deeply unsettling, then you're in the right place. Let's get into it. When classes began at Drexel University in Philadelphia on the cold morning of the 30th of November 1984, the campus was buzzing with its usual energy. Students were rushing to get to their classrooms, shivering in the chilly autumn air. But as some of those students were walking into Randall Hall, they made a gruesome discovery that would change the university forever. Crumpled at the bottom of an outdoor stairwell, hidden underneath a heavy gray jacket, was the body of a young woman. Her face was covered in deep cuts and severe bruising, showing that she had been brutally beaten. Around her neck, there was a deep, dark purple line where she had been strangled to death. She had no purse, no backpack, and absolutely nothing on her person to identify who she was. She was fully clothed, and there was no immediate evidence of sexual assault, but there was one very bizarre detail that stood out. She was completely missing her shoes and her socks. Her bare feet were exposed to the freezing air. The police were called to the scene immediately. They cordoned off the entire outdoor stairwell with yellow tape and began their investigation. Their very first suspicion was that this was a simple robbery that had turned deadly. But right away, the police knew they were in for a very difficult investigation. The first major hurdle was that there were absolutely no security cameras inside or outside of Randall Hall. This meant they could not just review footage to see who had been walking around the building. The second major hurdle was that Drexel University was not an isolated, closed-off campus. Its buildings were completely integrated into the urban streets of West Philadelphia. Randall Hall itself was located right along a known cut-through path that local residents used almost every single day to walk through the neighborhood. This meant there was a virtually unlimited number of potential suspects. To make matters worse, as the investigators analyzed the scene, it became very clear that this young woman had not been killed in this stairwell. She had been killed somewhere else and then dragged a great distance to this spot. The dragging process was likely how she lost her shoes and socks. The killer had then dumped her body at the bottom of the stairs and covered her with her own gray jacket. But just a couple of hours after the body was discovered, the police received a very lucky break. A young man who was incredibly combative and frantic rushed toward the closed-off crime scene. He was trying to push his way past the officers and demanded that they let him through because he said he knew the identity of the dead girl. The police were immediately suspicious of this. They had not released any details to the public, and they had not even identified the victim themselves. They pulled the young man aside and began interviewing him. He told the police his name was Kurt Rayner, and he was a student at Drexel. He said he believed the dead girl was his girlfriend, 20-year-old Debbie Wilson, who was also a student. He then proceeded to give the police a very long and highly complicated explanation of how he had figured out the identity of the victim. Kurt said that the night before, he had been with Debbie in the computer lab located in the basement of Randall Hall. He explained that Debbie had a massive project due the next day, and he had offered to keep her company while she worked on it. But by about 1:30 the morning, Debbie still had a lot of work left to do. Kurt said he was just incredibly tired and did not think he could stay awake any longer. So, he asked Debbie if it would be okay if he went back to his dorm early. Debbie told him it was totally fine. She was used to working late in the computer lab and felt perfectly safe. Kurt said that even though he wanted to stick around and walk her safely to her car when she was done, he felt like she would be okay, so he took off on his own. On his walk back to the dorm, Kurt said he passed by a campus security guard. He actually stopped and asked the guard if he would mind checking on his girlfriend in the basement computer lab because she was all alone and it was very late. The security guard told him it was no problem and that he would make sure she was okay. The next morning, when Kurt woke up, he heard rumors from other students about a young woman's body being found outside Randall Hall and that it looked like a murder. Kurt said he did not think much of it at first. But later that day, when he went to campus to meet up with Debbie, he saw her car still parked in the computer lab parking lot, looking like it had never moved. And then, when he arrived at their designated meeting spot, Debbie never showed up. He said it was at that exact point that he realized the dead woman in Randall Hall had to be Debbie. And he was not wrong. It was indeed Debbie. But the police were absolutely not buying his story. He was the last person known to have seen Debbie alive. And by his own admission, he had heard that morning about a dead woman being found at the very place he had left his girlfriend all alone, yet he waited hours before bringing this up to anyone. The police also noticed something highly alarming on his hands. Kurt had fresh bruises on his knuckles and a deep cut between his fingers. Suddenly, Kurt seemed like the primary suspect. The nature of the crime suggested a deeply personal motive. Strangulation is a highly intimate act. The killer is almost always face-to-face with their victim, and it requires a massive amount of physical strength and rage to complete. Afterward, the killer had covered Debbie's body with her own jacket, which is an act that investigators know indicates remorse, guilt, or respect for the victim. Generally, when a young woman is murdered, her romantic partner is the very first suspect. But instead of tipping Kurt off that they were focusing on him, the detectives told him to go back to his dorm room and that they would be in touch with him as the investigation developed. In the meantime, the investigators turned their attention to the computer lab in the basement of Randall Hall. They found the computer that Debbie had been using. She had logged in to start her project, but had never logged out. Her computer cursor was left blinking mid-sentence. The timestamp of her last activity was exactly 1:38 a.m., just 8 minutes after Kurt said he left her. This led investigators to believe she was interrupted by her attacker inside the lab. As they swept the room, they found 2 extension cords on the floor near her computer that perfectly matched the ligature marks on Debbie's neck. They also found a small spot of blood on the back of Debbie's chair, which they carefully collected and sent off for testing. But as the police looked around the lab, they realized they had suffered a massive setback. The computer lab and the hallway right outside looked incredibly neat and clean. It turned out that the university janitor had cleaned the entire area earlier that morning, likely destroying critical physical evidence without realizing a crime had been committed. The police interviewed the janitor, who had a rock-solid alibi, and was devastated to learn she had cleaned a crime scene. When asked if she noticed anything strange, she said everything seemed normal, but she did recall that the tables and chairs inside the lab had been moved and pushed around. She had not thought much of it because students often moved the furniture while studying. Because the police lacked any physical evidence, they could not arrest Kurt. Instead, they asked him to come down to the station for a formal interview. During the questioning, Kurt vehemently insisted he had nothing to do with Debbie's death. As for the bruises and the cut on his hand, he claimed he had punched a concrete wall in a fit of grief after finding out what had happened to Debbie. He said the cut between his fingers was from working on his car a few days earlier. Since neither of those statements could be disproven, and they had no physical evidence linking him to the crime, the police had to let him go. They then began digging deeper into his alibi. Kurt had told them that he passed a security guard on his walk back to his dorm and asked him to check on Debbie. The police tracked down that security guard, whose name was Bryce Clapman. Clapman was a longtime employee of Drexel with a stellar work record and no criminal history. Clapman completely confirmed Kurt's story. He said he spoke with Kurt around 1:30 inches the morning. After their conversation, Clapman used his radio to contact Bronson Ziegler, who was one of the two security guards working inside Randall Hall that night. Clapman told Ziegler that he or the other guard on duty, David Dixon, needed to go down to the basement and check on the girl. Clapman also mentioned that shortly after making that call, he saw a figure, presumably a student, walking outside Randall Hall. He said it was too dark and he was too far away to see any features, but he definitely saw someone walking around the premises around 1:30 a.m. Clapman stated he never went inside Randall Hall that night and volunteered to take a lie detector test. The police then ran background checks on the two guards who were inside Randall Hall, Bronson Ziegler and David Dixon. Dixon was a military veteran with a pristine record who was still active in the Army Reserves. Ziegler, however, had a much darker past. It turned out he had spent time in jail for burglary and had actually lied about his criminal record to get his job as a security guard. When police interviewed Ziegler, he was incredibly evasive, defensive, and frustrated. He admitted he received the message from Clapman to check on the girl, but said he did not feel like doing it himself. So, he claimed he radioed Dixon and told him to go do it instead. Ziegler insisted he had performed his security rounds properly. He told detectives they could check his security clock. This clock was a device that guards carried with them, which required them to insert keys located at designated stations along their route, stamping a physical card with the exact time of their arrival. When the police checked Ziegler's punch card, it showed he had hit all his stations at the correct times. But the detectives knew this did not clear him, as there was plenty of time in between his rounds to commit the crime. Toward the end of his interview, Ziegler became angry and sarcastically told detectives that yes, he killed Debbie, and then flatly refused to take a lie detector test. When the police interviewed David Dixon, he gave a completely different account. He said Ziegler had never radioed him and had never asked him to check on the girl in the computer lab. However, Dixon did say he was aware someone was working late. He explained that around 2:15 inches the morning, he walked past the basement lab, saw the lights on, and heard the loud sound of printers working inside. Not wanting to disturb whoever was in there, he did not look inside. He said he spent the next couple of hours talking on the phone with his girlfriend. Then, around 4:0 inches the morning, he went back to the lab. The lights were off and the door was locked, so he assumed they had finished and left and that Ziegler had locked up. When asked why neither he nor Ziegler had discovered Debbie's body, Dixon explained that their security rounds did not extend outside the building, so they never would have seen her in the outdoor stairwell. At this point, Bryce Clapman and David Dixon were ruled out as suspects, but Bronson Ziegler became their primary focus. However, just like with the boyfriend Kurt, there was no physical evidence tying Ziegler to the crime, so they could not arrest him. The investigators decided to try and identify the mysterious person Clapman had seen walking around Randall Hall at 1:30 a.m. After conducting interviews, they discovered it was a 28-year-old PhD student named Ashlyn Berhard. Berhard was known for keeping very long hours in his office, which happened to be located directly above the outdoor stairwell where Debbie was found. But he was also known for some highly disturbing behavior. Several female secretaries in his department reported that Berhard had a habit of creeping up behind them and suddenly holding a sharp pencil to their necks, threatening to kill them. When interviewed, Berhard admitted he was in Randall Hall that night, but claimed he did not know Debbie and had not left his office all night. He agreed to take a lie detector test, but failed it. When confronted, he scrambled for an explanation and named 2 other graduate students who could provide an alibi. But when police spoke to those students, they said Berhard had left the office around 1:00 the morning and was gone for about 3 hours. Berhard then claimed he had simply forgotten to mention that he left to take a nap in one of the study rooms, and that it was just a coincidence his nap coincided with the murder. The detectives did not believe him, but once again they had no physical evidence linking him to the crime. The police continued to look for other suspects. They began speaking to Debbie's friends, and that is when they learned that Debbie had a stalker. It was another student named Alan Smith. Alan had been a close friend of Debbie's, but when he tried to make the relationship romantic, Debbie rejected him. Alan did not take it well. He began following Debbie around campus, trying to force her to talk to him. Just the day before Debbie was killed, friends had witnessed a massive fight between them in the middle of campus, where Alan had grabbed Debbie's shoulder, shook her, and screamed in her face. The police tracked Alan down, but he had no alibi, claiming he was alone in his apartment. Like all the other suspects, there was no physical evidence tying him to the crime. Around this time, the lab results from the small spot of blood found on the back of Debbie's chair finally came back. Since DNA profiling did not exist in 1984, the lab could only determine the blood type. The test showed the blood was type A. Debbie's blood was type O, meaning this drop of blood almost certainly belonged to her killer, who must have been cut during the struggle. The police immediately obtained blood samples from Kurt Rayner, Bronson Ziegler, Ashlyn Berhard, and Alan Smith. They were confident that one of them would be type A. But when the results came back, not a single one of them had type A blood. It was a crushing blow to the entire investigation. With no suspects left, the case began to stall. A wave of panic swept through the Drexel University campus. Students were outraged by the lack of security and demanded that guards be allowed to carry weapons. The university offered a $10,000 reward, and the president advised everyone to use the buddy system, stating he believed the killer was likely someone from their own community. No one could understand why anyone would target Debbie. She was a wonderfully kind young woman who worked incredibly hard. She had modeled in high school, but was not vain, even turning down braces because she was worried it would ruin her clarinet playing. She kept a picture of a Mercedes-Benz above her desk to keep herself motivated. That picture was still hanging there after she was gone. Her hard work had put her in danger that night, as she was determined to stay as late as necessary to finish her project. The physical evidence they did have did not seem to make sense. It did not appear to be a simple robbery. While she was missing her shoes and socks, she was still wearing an expensive watch. About a week after the murder, her backpack mysteriously turned up in the campus lost and found. No one knew who put it there, but all of her belongings were still intact inside. The police chased down every lead, but eventually the case went completely cold. In 1985, the Philadelphia Inquirer ran a story about the unsolved cases that haunted detectives the most, and Debbie's was at the top of the list. The lead investigators admitted they believed it was a random attack and feared the killer would strike again. Fast forward to the spring of 1992. Debbie's murder had been languishing in a cold case file for 8 years. The case was finally assigned to a new cold case squad led by Detective Bob Snyder. Desperate for a breakthrough, Snyder decided to throw a Hail Mary. He took the entire case file to the Vidocq Society. This was a private, highly exclusive club of elite criminology experts who met once a month in Philadelphia to review unsolved cases. The members included top homicide detectives, prosecutors, defense attorneys, FBI agents, forensic scientists, and even an aeronautic physicist. During one of their closed-door meetings, Detective Snyder stood before the society and presented every detail of Debbie Wilson's murder. For several hours, the members of the society debated the details, but could not find a way forward. Then, a man named Richard Walter stood up. Walter was a founding member of the society and a world-renowned criminal psychologist who had spent his career profiling dangerous killers. Walter looked at the crime scene details and told the detectives that they had missed the most important clue in the entire case: Debbie's missing shoes and socks. The original investigators had assumed they had simply fallen off while her body was being dragged. But Walter argued that while shoes might fall off, socks almost never slide off completely during dragging. He proposed that the killer had deliberately taken her white Reebok sneakers and her socks as trophies. Walter believed the killer was a power-assertive, macho type of personality who possessed a severe pathological foot fetish. Detective Snyder was intrigued by this profile and decided to bring the theory back to his team. They began reopening the case and re-interviewing everyone involved. When they spoke to the former manager of the computer lab at Randall Hall, he mentioned a small detail that had always bothered him. He told the detectives that the high-speed printers in the basement lab were connected to a central university system that was programmed to automatically shut down at exactly 10 p.m. every single night. Therefore, there was absolutely no way anyone could have heard printers running in that lab in the middle of the night. When Detective Snyder heard this, he was stunned. He immediately remembered the statement of David Dixon, the pristine military veteran who had been ruled out as a suspect. Dixon had claimed that at 2:15 inches the morning, he had walked past the computer lab and decided not to check inside because he heard the loud sound of the printers running. If the printers shut off at 10 p.m., Dixon was lying. The detectives immediately began looking much more closely at David Dixon. They requested his complete military record from the Army, and when they looked at the very back of his file, they found a disciplinary report from 1979. The report stated that during his first year of service, Dixon had been arrested for breaking into another soldier's barracks locker. The only item he had stolen was a pair of dirty, used white Reebok sneakers. This was the exact type of shoe that Debbie was known to wear. The police then began tracking down Dixon's former and current neighbors. They interviewed several women who had lived next to him over the years. At least 4 of these women reported that their apartments had been broken into while they were away. But what was bizarre was that the intruder had ignored their cash, jewelry, and electronics. The only things that were ever stolen were their used white athletic shoes and their dirty socks. None of the women had ever been able to find out who was responsible, but they all lived right next door to David Dixon. Armed with this evidence, Detective Snyder obtained a search warrant for Dixon's apartment. When officers conducted the search, they opened his closet and found a disturbing collection. Tucked away in the back were 20 pairs of used women's white athletic shoes, each pair meticulously wrapped in individual plastic bags to preserve them as trophies. They also uncovered 77 homemade video cassettes. When they played the tapes, they found hours of footage that Dixon had secretly recorded of women's feet as they walked around the campus and the city, always focusing on their white shoes. The detectives then went to interview Dixon's ex-wife, who had been his girlfriend on the night of the murder. Dixon had claimed his alibi was that he had spent hours on the phone chatting with her, but when the detectives spoke to her, she completely shattered his story. She told them that they had only spoken for a couple of minutes that night, not hours. Dixon had lied to the police to cover up his whereabouts during the exact hours that Debbie was killed. In June of 1993, the police officially arrested David Dixon and charged him with the first-degree murder of Debbie Wilson. While he refused to speak to the detectives and maintained his innocence, he could not keep his mouth shut once he was placed in a jail cell. Dixon began bragging to his cellmate about the crime. He told him in graphic detail how he had snuck into the computer lab, confronted Debbie, and killed her because he wanted to have his way with her feet and take her shoes as a prize. The cellmate, completely disgusted, immediately reported the confession to the guards. At the trial, the prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including the stolen shoes, the videotapes, the broken alibi, and the cellmate's testimony. David Dixon was found guilty of the murder of Debbie Wilson and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The tragedy of Debbie's death left a deep, permanent scar on her family and the Drexel community. For nearly 10 years, her loved ones had to live with the agonizing pain of not knowing who had taken her away or why. Her dreams of graduating, playing her clarinet, and one day driving that Mercedes-Benz were stolen from her in an instant, all because of a predator's bizarre and deadly obsession. But because of the dedication of a relentless detective and the brilliant minds of the Vidocq Society, justice was finally served and a dangerous killer was taken off the streets forever. In this case, the truth was never hidden. It was simply overlooked. So, the next time something doesn't make sense, it might be worth asking, what small detail are we missing? Let me know what you think in the comments. Think about the last time something happened to you that felt too precise to be an accident. Maybe it was small. You thought of someone you hadn't spoken to in years, and they called that afternoon. Maybe it was slightly stranger than that. Or maybe, if you're honest, there was one moment in your life that you still can't fully explain. One moment where the timing was so exact, the collision of two separate paths so perfectly arranged that the idea of pure randomness starts to feel almost naive. The 5 stories you're about to hear are not small coincidences. One of them is about a father and a daughter, both looking for each other on the same street on the same afternoon, captured together in a single photograph neither of them knew was being taken. One is about a man who told Hollywood he was nobody and accidentally convinced the right person that he was exactly who they needed. One is about a man who has been swallowed by the ocean, by the jungle, by sharks, and eventually by a whale, and who keeps walking back out. One is about a sheriff on a plane in a snowstorm who looked out his window at exactly the right second and saved a man who did not deserve to be saved. One is about a stranger who got into the wrong truck and ended up destroying the one life that had nothing to do with any of it. 5 stories. 5 moments where you'll ask yourself, what are the odds? But here's the thing about that question. Sometimes the answer is beautiful. Sometimes the answer is that the universe quietly intervened and 2 people found each other after a decade of searching. And sometimes the answer is that the same impossible precision, the same 1 in a trillion alignment of time and place puts a monster exactly where he needs to be. The odds don't care which outcome you're hoping for. They just land where they land. Let's get into it. If you're someone who likes strange, dark, and mysterious stories told like a film, you are in exactly the right place. That is all we do here, and we upload once a week. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's go. In 2007, a 60-year-old man named Michael Dick was living a quiet life in Bow, East London, with his wife and 2 daughters. He had spent most of his working years as a carpenter, and now, semi-retired, he spent the bulk of his time around family, around friends, in the rhythm of a life that was ordinary, in the best sense of the word. But that year, something started pulling at him. 10 years earlier, Michael had gone through a difficult divorce from his first wife. The split had been messy, the kind of divorce that leaves no clean lines, no good feelings, and a lot of distance between people who once shared a life. When it was finalized, his ex-wife had stayed in the family home in Sudbury, in the county of Suffolk, about an hour and a half north of London. Their daughter from that marriage, Lisa, who had been 21 at the time, had stayed with her mother. And Michael had gone south. And the years had passed. And now 10 of them were gone. He hadn't spoken to Lisa in a decade. He didn't have her phone number. He didn't know her address. He didn't even know where his ex-wife was anymore, which meant that route was closed too. Lisa had been 21 when he last saw her. She was 31 now. He had missed a significant portion of her adult life, and sitting with that fact in 2007, Michael found that he could no longer just let it sit. He talked to his wife. He talked to his 2 younger daughters. He told them he needed to find Lisa. Not wanted to, need to. And so they agreed. They would go to Sudbury and start from the only fixed point they still had, which was the address of the old family home. In August of that year, Michael and his two daughters loaded into the car and drove north to Sudbury. He found his old street. He parked in front of the house he had once lived in, got out alone, walked to the door, and knocked. A family he didn't recognize answered. They knew nothing about his ex-wife. They knew nothing about Lisa. They wished him luck and closed the door, and Michael walked back to the car carrying the particular weight of a plan that had already failed at the first step. The three of them drove around Sudbury for a while, half hoping they might simply spot Lisa on the street somewhere, knowing that was almost certainly not going to happen, and gradually arriving at a more practical idea: the local newspaper. If they could get a small feature placed in the Suffolk Free Press, a photo, a short write-up, Michael's contact information, a note explaining that he was looking for his daughter, maybe Lisa would see it. Maybe she still had connections to Sudbury. Maybe someone who knew her would pass it along. They drove to the paper's offices and went inside. A reporter listened to Michael's story and agreed it was worth a small feature. He and a photographer brought Michael and his daughters outside. The photographer positioned them on the pavement in front of the building and took the picture. Michael thanked them. He and his daughters got back in the car and drove home to East London. Now we need to follow Lisa. At the same time, Michael had been sitting in East London, feeling the pull toward his first daughter. Lisa, now 31, married, a mother of three, had been feeling the exact same pull in reverse. She had been thinking about her father, about the fact that her own children had a grandfather they had never met, about whether it was too late to do something about that. She had no way to reach him. No phone number. No address. She checked social media and found nothing. She asked her mother and her friends for ideas and came up with no clear path forward. Then, one afternoon in August, Lisa was in the break room at her office when she picked up a copy of the Suffolk Free Press that someone had left on the coffee table. She flipped through the pages. And then she stopped. Because she saw herself. There was a photograph in the paper taken somewhere in Sudbury, and in the background of that photograph was a woman who was clearly her, walking along the pavement. She had been in Sudbury just a couple of days earlier, visiting her mother, talking about strategies for finding her father, and then walking back through the town center to get to her car. She glanced at the caption. The three people in the foreground of that photograph, the man and the two girls who were the actual subject of the image, were her father and her two half-sisters. She just hadn't recognized them. She was looking at her own image in the background and hadn't yet processed that the strangers in the front were the people she had been looking for. For a moment, just breathe with that. On the one afternoon that Lisa was in Sudbury specifically to discuss how to find her father, she walked into the frame of the photograph her father was having taken for the purpose of finding her. 100 feet separated them on that pavement. They were walking in the same direction, in the same town, for the same reason, without knowing the other was there. And the photographer, who had no idea any of this was happening, pressed the shutter at exactly the moment that captured all of them in the same frame. Lisa read the article. She got her father's contact information. She called him. Michael's first reaction, reportedly, was that this was a scam. Someone had read the article, seen an opportunity, and was impersonating his daughter. It took some convincing. But eventually, he believed it was real, and he drove straight to Sudbury, and he met his grandchildren for the first time. Today, Michael and Lisa are still in contact. There is no explanation for why the photographer took the shot at that precise second. There is no explanation for why Lisa happened to be in Sudbury on that particular day. There is no explanation for why, out of all the days and all the streets and all the windows and all the copies of a local newspaper sitting on coffee tables across that part of England, these two people found each other through a single accidental image in a free weekly paper. But here is the detail that stays with me longest. Lisa had gone to Sudbury specifically to talk to her mother about strategies for finding her father. That was the purpose of the trip. She was sitting in her mother's house, probably at a kitchen table, probably with a cup of something warm, working through the problem of how to locate someone who had moved on and left no trail. and then she walked back through the town center to get to her car. Someone at that same moment was standing in front of the offices of the local paper, being photographed for the article that was supposed to solve the exact same problem from his direction. They were not just in the same town. They were both actively in the middle of searching. Both of them mid-effort, mid-plan, mid-hope. And neither knew the other was there 100 feet behind them doing the same thing from the other side. When Lisa eventually called Michael and convinced him it was real, and he drove to Sudbury to meet her, there would have been a moment, some moment in that first meeting, maybe over a meal, maybe standing on a doorstep, where someone said, "We were there at the same time." We were that close. And neither of us knew. What do you do with that? There's no clean emotional response to it. There is grief in it. 10 years of distance, of not knowing, of children growing up without grandparents, and a father without his daughter. There is also something that feels almost like a joke the universe is telling, except the punchline is one you actually wanted. They were looking for each other. They were right there. A photograph caught what neither of them could see. Sometimes the universe just gets it right. And sometimes it lets you see the evidence afterward. In the final semester of his college education in Wisconsin, a 21-year-old man named Harry signed up for an acting class because he thought it would be easy. He was shy by nature and figured the class might help him come out of himself a little. He expected to sit in a room, read some lines, get his grade, and move on. Instead, two things happened. He met the woman who would become his wife. And he discovered, to his genuine surprise, that he actually loved acting. When he graduated, Harry and his new wife made the decision that most people who feel that particular love decide to make. They went to Hollywood. He auditioned for Columbia Pictures' New Talent Program, a pipeline designed to give new actors and actresses a foot in the door at a time when getting any foothold in Hollywood was nearly impossible. He was accepted. He signed a contract that paid him almost nothing. And the program immediately began sending him out for parts. Nobody wanted Harry. This is not a cruel summary, it's what happened. Month after month, the only roles that materialized were minor and non-speaking. The kind of roles that don't advance a career. The kind that fills out a crowd scene. After 2 years of this, in 1966, something changed. Harry was offered a speaking role in an actual film. Not a lead. Not a supporting part. A 60-second scene where he played a bellhop in a hotel, walked on screen, called out for a guest, found the guest, handed him a piece of paper, and left. Forgettable. But real. A real scene in a real movie with real lines that he actually got to say. Harry went to the studio and filmed it. He thought it went well. He came back to the New Talent Program offices afterward, and before he'd barely gotten through the door, one of the producers in charge of the program called him over and asked him to come upstairs. They sat down. The producer told him he had seen the scene. And then he told Harry directly and without much warmth that he was not going to make it in Hollywood. He said, when Tony Curtis carried groceries across a room in one of his first movies, everyone watching knew immediately that man was going to be a star. You could see something in him even when he was doing nothing. When you walked around as that bellhop, I didn't see it. You don't have it. You are not going to be a movie star. Harry sat there for a moment. Then he leaned forward and said, if Tony was such a good actor, shouldn't we have believed he was just a grocery delivery boy, not a movie star? The producer fired him on the spot. Harry signed a similar deal with Universal Studios. Universal's feedback was slightly different in its wording, but identical in its conclusion. Not pretty enough, not talented enough, no future here. By the mid-1970s, Harry was in his mid-30s. He still wanted to act, that hadn't changed. The love of it hadn't gone anywhere, but he was making almost nothing from it. He had a wife. He had 2 sons. He needed money. And so he made a decision that had nothing to do with any particular aptitude and everything to do with necessity. He would become a carpenter. He checked out every how-to book on carpentry he could find at the library. He practiced. He did projects around his own house. And then, when he felt either sufficiently confident or sufficiently desperate, he started calling people in his network and asking if anyone needed woodworking done. Hollywood, it turned out, had a surprising number of people who needed woodworking done, and before long, Harry had built up enough of a client base that someone gave him a name, the Carpenter to the Stars. Which was, as he would later acknowledge himself, somewhat ironic, given that he was frequently spotted on job sites holding a carpentry manual in one hand while doing the actual carpentry with the other. In 1976, Harry had been a full-time carpenter for about a year when one of his closest friends, a man named Fred Roos, who was a casting director and film producer, called him with what he described as an opportunity. Harry was not interested. He said so directly. He had accepted, more or less, that acting was behind him. He had a family to support, a business that was working, and no desire to go back into rooms where people told him he wasn't good enough. Fred told him this was different. This wasn't a standard audition. This was a situation where a very specific, very unusual director needed one more person for an audition session, and the person was not being asked to actually try out for anything. He would just sit in the room, read lines so the real candidates could deliver their performances against someone, and that was it. The director, who was known for running group auditions so he could assess chemistry and dynamic in real time, was short one male actor because someone had dropped out last minute. Fred had volunteered Harry to fill the slot. Harry pointed out, not incorrectly, that this sounded like a waste of an afternoon. Fred acknowledged that it might be. But he also pointed out that this director was becoming a significant figure in Hollywood and that the other people in that room were going to be people worth knowing, even if nothing came of the acting. Worst case, Harry walked away with a couple of potential carpentry clients and an afternoon out of the house. Fred said, "Just go. Read the lines. Don't try to act." They told me specifically he's there to facilitate the audition, not to participate in it. Just go. Harry went. He was handed the script. He was reminded more than once that he was not auditioning. Just read the lines. Monotone was fine. The other people in the room were the ones being evaluated. He was furniture. And so Harry sat there, bored, slightly irritated at having been voluntold into this situation, not performing for anyone, and just reading, being himself. Which, as it turned out, meant coming across as a grumpy, sarcastic, somewhat alpha man who didn't particularly care what anyone in the room thought of him. Because he didn't. He was only there because Fred had essentially guilt-tripped him into it, and he wasn't pretending otherwise. This, as it turned out, was exactly the quality that the director had been trying to find in one of the central characters of the film he was casting. That specific gravity, that particular kind of man who seems like he's not performing for anyone because he isn't. Nobody told Harry what was happening. He read the lines all day, decided at the end of the session that he could now throw the script in the trash and never think about this again, and was on his way out when the director walked up to him. The director's name was George Lucas. The man he had been watching all day, the man who thought he was just there to read lines and go home, was Harrison Ford. And George Lucas said, "I was wrong. You are perfect for this. I need you to play Han Solo." Harrison Ford said yes. The rest of that story is a matter of record. Star Wars was released in 1977 and became one of the most successful films in cinema history. Harrison Ford went from a carpenter who kept books in his tool belt to one of the most recognizable actors alive. A few years after all of this, after Star Wars, after the sequels, after Harrison Ford had become the kind of name people recognized everywhere, he was having lunch at a restaurant on a Hollywood studio lot when a waiter approached with a silver tray. On the tray was a single business card. The waiter set it down and walked away. Harrison picked up the card and flipped it over. On one side, written by hand, were 3 words, "I missed my bet." On the other side was the name of the producer from the New Talent program, the one who had called Harry into his office in 1966, told him he had no future, and fired him on the spot. The man was apparently in the same restaurant, had spotted Harrison across the room, and had sent over that card as an acknowledgement. A concession. An olive branch, maybe, or just an honest admission from someone who had been spectacularly wrong? Harrison Ford would later say in interviews that the moment he understood what he was looking at, the card, the message, the implication that this producer was somewhere in that room watching him, he scanned the room once, couldn't pick the man out because he genuinely had no idea what he looked like, decided he wasn't going to waste any more time looking, set the card down on the table, and went back to his lunch. He didn't need to find the man. The card said everything. There are people who appear to exist slightly outside the normal rules. Michael Packard is one of them. In 2001, when Michael was 38 years old, he was on a small plane over Costa Rica when it crashed. The pilot, co-pilot, and one passenger were killed on impact. Michael and 4 other passengers survived badly, injured, stranded in a remote section of jungle with no road access and no way to know whether the distress signal they were sending from the wreckage was reaching anyone. They waited 48 hours. Rescuers found them. A doctor at the hospital where Michael was treated told him afterward that based on his injuries, he would not have survived another night in the jungle. The odds of being in a plane crash at all, depending on your source, sit somewhere between 1 in 5 million and 1 in 20 million. To be in one, to survive it, and to be told you had one night left, that alone is a story most people would carry for the rest of their lives. Michael carried it and kept moving. Over the following 2 decades, Michael, who worked as a commercial diver and spent most of his professional life in the water off the coast of California and later Massachusetts, would survive not 1, but 2 significant encounters with great white sharks. He would get lost at sea on open water, treading in the middle of the ocean with no land visible in any direction for hours before a boat found him. He would discover the body of a long-missing person submerged roughly 60 feet below the surface off the coast of Massachusetts. Each of these, on its own, would be a defining moment for most people. For Michael Packard, they appear to be something closer to recurring themes. But of everything that has happened to Michael Packard, nothing compares to the morning of the 11th of June 2021. He was 57 years old. He and his longtime diving partner Josiah loaded their equipment into a boat and headed out from the shore of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. The plan was lobster diving, a method that involves going down to the seafloor by hand and retrieving lobsters without any cage or trap system. Just a diver, the bottom of the ocean, and whatever happens to be down there. They reached their spot just after 6 in the morning. Josiah stayed in the boat. Michael suited up, checked his equipment, gave the signal, and went under. The first few dives produced a modest haul. Not the best day for lobsters, they agreed, but not nothing. By 8 in the morning, Michael had brought up approximately 100 pounds of lobsters. A decent morning. They decided he'd go down once more, one final dive, and then they'd call it and head back. Michael put his mouthpiece back in, gave the thumbs up, disappeared below the surface. Josiah watched the water. It was calm, quiet. And then, from somewhere below where Michael had gone down, the surface erupted a violent churning of white water shooting upward like something enormous had moved very fast just beneath it. Josiah leaned over the edge of the boat and looked down. He could see something large moving below. He could not see Michael. What had happened, as Michael would describe it later, was this. He had descended to around 45 feet, not yet at the bottom, still working his way down, when something struck him from behind with enough force that his entire body was thrown sideways and everything around him went instantly black. The impact knocked the mouthpiece out of his mouth. He was now 45 feet below the surface with no air supply, in complete darkness, and he immediately began reaching for the line connected to his mouthpiece so he could get it back. But as his hands moved through the dark space around him, they found walls. Soft walls that were also somehow firm, walls that were warm, walls that seemed to pulse and flex. He was enclosed. He was inside something. The space was relatively large enough that he wasn't immediately compressed, but it was not still. It was moving and moving fast, and the water inside it was sloshing violently against every surface. He kept reaching for the mouthpiece line. He found it. He jammed it into his mouth and inhaled. And with air back in his lungs, he had his first coherent thought. Has a shark swallowed me? He reached for teeth, feeling along the inner walls for the thing that would confirm his worst assumption. But there were no teeth. Only those shifting, pulsing walls. And then the pressure concentrated specifically on his legs intensified. That was when he understood. He had been swallowed by a humpback whale. Not a shark. A humpback. An animal that can reach 60 feet in length and 70,000 pounds in weight, and that survives entirely on small fish and krill, which meant that what was currently clamped around Michael's legs was the whale's mouth, and the whale was in the process of trying to figure out what it had accidentally collected. For approximately 45 seconds, Michael Packard was inside the closed mouth of a living humpback whale, 45 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. When the whale registered that this was not a small fish, it began shaking its head hard, back and forth to dislodge whatever it had taken in. That motion was what Josiah saw from the boat, the eruption of white water at the surface as an animal the size of a school bus thrashed its head to get rid of the thing in its mouth. After several seconds of this, Michael was expelled. He came out into open water with enough ambient light filtering down that he could see around him. The water was turbulent and disorienting. He looked down. Directly below him, the tail of the whale slid through his field of vision as the animal swam away, apparently unconcerned. Michael made it to the surface. Josiah pulled him into the boat. The first thing Michael managed to say was that he had been inside it, and that it had tried to eat him. He was taken to shore and transported to a hospital where he was evaluated. The extent of his injuries, significant bruising on his legs where the whale's mouth had been closing, no broken bones, no internal damage. No respiratory complications despite having spent the better part of a minute without consistent air supply at depth. He was discharged that afternoon. In interviews afterward, Michael Packard spoke about being swallowed by a whale with a kind of settled calm that suggested either profound equanimity or a complete recalibration of what counts as unusual. Reporters asked him how he felt, what he would do differently, whether he was going to stop diving. He said he was going back in the water as soon as he was able. Experts estimated the probability of a human being accidentally swallowed by a humpback whale taken alive into the closed mouth of a living cetacean and then expelled at approximately 1 in 1 trillion. Michael Packard had already survived a plane crash, 2 great white shark encounters, and being lost at sea. The ocean has tried to keep him 4 times. He keeps coming home. On the evening of the 6th of January, 1982, a man named Harold Bray, a sheriff in Jefferson County, Colorado, an area sitting just west of Denver along the edge of the Rocky Mountains, arrived at Denver International Airport running late. A snowstorm had been working over the Denver metro area for most of the day, and the drive-in had been slow and treacherous. Harold had made it, but barely. He checked in, cleared security, and reached his gate just as boarding had begun. He filed into the queue, found his seat at the front right side of the plane, buckled in, picked up the in-flight magazine from the seat pocket in front of him, and waited. 15 minutes later, the plane began its roll down the runway and lifted into the night. Harold looked out the window. Denver at night from the air is a grid of amber and white light, spreading east across the plains and pressing west against the dark wall of the Front Range. Harold knew this view well. He spent enough time in Jefferson County to know the geography below him without needing a map. And so as the plane climbed and banked west, he tracked the landscape. The city, the suburbs, the black mass of open land before the mountains began. And then something in the dark caught his eye. Cutting through the Rockies directly west of Jefferson County was a stretch of road called the Guanella Pass, 22 miles of switchbacks climbing over an 11,000-foot mountain crossing. In summer, it was a scenic drive. In winter, it was closed. Not advisable, not discouraged, closed. The road was not maintained once the snow came, and the combination of elevation, grade, and exposure made it impassable for any vehicle that didn't belong there. From the window of the ascending plane, Harold could see headlights on the Guanella Pass. In a snowstorm, at night, on a road that was supposed to have no one on it. He leaned toward the window and looked harder. The headlights weren't moving. The vehicle was stationary. And then he saw it, a light extending out from one of the windows, flashing upward into the sky. On, off, on, off. Deliberate. Rhythmic. The unmistakable signal of someone who needed help and was trying to be seen. Harold understood, in a way that required no deliberation, what he was looking at. He also understood that the probability of another plane flying over that particular section of mountains at that hour and having someone on board who recognized what they were seeing was essentially zero. If he sat back down, put the magazine in front of his face, and let the plane continue on its way, that person on the Guanella Pass would not be found until it was too late. It was negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit on that mountain that night. Harold got up, climbed over the person in the seat next to him, found a flight attendant in the aisle, and explained quickly and clearly what he had seen and what he believed it meant. The attendant took him seriously. They went to the cockpit. The pilots got on the radio. 15 minutes later, the fire department had been dispatched to the Guanella Pass. He found a small pickup truck buried nose first in a snowbank, engine running, headlights still on. The man inside was named Alan Phillips, 30 years old, a mechanic from the Denver area. He was wearing a light jacket and jeans. He had a small blanket pulled around him. He had been there long enough that the cold had become something beyond discomfort, moving into the early territory of hypothermia. When Dave reached his window, Alan was crying before Dave had even introduced himself. Dave asked what had happened. Alan told him he'd had a few drinks at a bar and decided to drive home through the Guanella Pass, forgetting or not fully accounting for the fact that the road was not maintained in winter. He'd lost traction not far in and slid off the road into the snowbank. He'd tried to free the truck. Couldn't. So he'd done the only thing he could think of, grabbed his flashlight and pointed it at the sky and hoped that someone somewhere might see it and understand. Dave asked about the deep bruise on Alan's cheek. Alan, in a moment of sheepish honesty, explained that after getting stuck, he had needed to step outside to relieve himself. He walked a few feet from the truck. When he turned to walk back, the blowing snow was so dense that he couldn't see the truck. He panicked and ran directly into the door of his own vehicle, face first. Dave told him he was one lucky man. He was not wrong, just not in the way either of them understood. The story ran in local papers over the following days. Some national outlets picked it up. The miracle at Guanella Pass. A sheriff on a plane, a flashlight in a snowstorm, an improbable rescue at 11,000 feet. It had everything a feel-good story needed. Harold Bray, the unlikely hero who happened to look out the right window. Alan Phillips, the shaken survivor who had made a stupid decision and nearly paid for it with his life. Dave Montoya and the fire department, who had driven a four-wheel drive into a blizzard in the middle of the night because someone passed a message down from a plane. The whole thing read like something that was meant to happen, like the story was pointing somewhere good. That headline did not age well. 38 years later, in 2020, DNA evidence connected Alan Phillips to two unsolved murders that had occurred on the same night he got stuck on the Guanella Pass. Earlier that evening, several hours before his truck slid off the road, Alan had picked up a 22-year-old woman named Annette Schnee, who was hitchhiking in an area near Breen Ridge, Colorado, roughly 50 miles from the pass. She got into the truck. Based on what investigators believe happened next, Alan produced a weapon, restrained her with zip-tie handcuffs, drove to a remote location, walked her into the woods, and shot her in the back. Her body was found face down in a stream. A couple of hours later, Alan picked up a second hitchhiker, a 29-year-old woman named Barbara Oberholzer. She got into the truck. He restrained her the same way. But Barbara broke free of her restraints. She struck Allen in the face, the blow that left that deep bruise on his cheek that he gave Dave Montoya such an embarrassed little smile about. She threw open the door of the moving truck and ran. Allen stopped the truck, got out, chased her down, shot her in the chest. He pushed her body off the side of a cliff into the snowbank below. And then he got back in his truck and drove toward the Guanella Pass, heading for the mountains, trying to put miles between himself and what he had done. He didn't know the road was closed. Or he didn't care. Either way, he didn't make it far before the truck went sideways on the ice and buried itself in the snowbank. And so he sat there in the dark, in the cold, a man who had just killed 2 women and was now going to die of exposure on a mountain in a snowstorm, and he did the one thing he could think of. He pointed a flashlight at the sky. And Harold Bray, a sheriff in Jefferson County, happened to look out his window at the right moment, from the right angle, at the right altitude, and saw it. In February of 2021, Alan Phillips, 70 years old at the time, still living in the Denver area, was arrested for both murders. Annette Schnee and Barbara Oberholzer had been dead hours of 38 years before anyone was charged with killing them. The rescue and the crime exist on the same night. The same flashlight. The same snowbank. The same man. One moment was described as a miracle. The other was not. The odds of Harold Bray being on that plane at that altitude, looking out that window at that exact second, the odds are nearly incalculable. Just like the odds of being swallowed by a whale. Just like the odds of finding your daughter in the background of a photograph you didn't know she was in, the difference is what the odds were in service of. Just after midnight on the 22nd of June 1991, a man named Charles Holden was on his way home from work in Harrington, Delaware, when he stopped at a fast food restaurant near his house. He ate. He got back into his truck. He started the engine. He was about to pull out of the lot when he saw a man jogging toward him from across the parking lot, waving him down. Charles stopped. He rolled down his window. The man said his sister was having a baby. He needed a ride to the hospital about 20 minutes away. He was asking for help. Charles looked at him. It was past midnight. He didn't know this man. And something about the interaction felt off in a way that Charles couldn't articulate but also couldn't dismiss. The feeling you get sometimes when your body registers something before your mind catches up. He said no. Too late, too far out of his way, he needed to get home. The man's face fell. He turned and walked away. Charles watched him go. And then he felt bad. There's a particular discomfort in watching someone walk away who has just asked you for something, even if you have good reasons for saying no. Charles sat there for a moment with that discomfort. Then he called out to the man and told him to come back. He'd take him part of the way. The man got in. They drove in the direction of the hospital. After about 3 miles, Charles pulled over on the side of the road and told the man this was as far as he was going. He lived only a block away, and he wasn't going to drive further from home at this hour of the night. The man in the passenger seat went quiet. Then he went angry. His hand went into his pocket. He started screaming, "Give him the keys, give him the wallet, hand everything over right now or he was going to kill him." Charles didn't deliberate. He turned off the truck, ripped the keys from the ignition, shoved open his door, and ran. Off in the distance, he could see a convenience store, lights still on. He ran for it. But when he turned and looked behind him, the man had gotten out and was running too fast, gaining a screwdriver raised in his hand. Charles ran the math. He wasn't going to make the store. He stopped, turned around, raised his hands. He told the man, "Okay, get back in the truck. I'll drive you wherever you want to go. You can have my keys, my wallet, everything. Just let's get back to the truck." The man smiled. He prodded Charles forward with the screwdriver. They walked back to the vehicle, together with Charles in front, the man directly behind him, screwdriver periodically touching his back. Charles got to the driver's side door. The man told him to get in and wait. Charles got in, started the engine, and drove. He floored it. He looked in the mirror as he accelerated away and watched the man standing in the road behind him, screaming, screwdriver raised above his head, and then receding until he was too small to make out, and then gone. Charles drove for a while. He breathed. He thought about calling the police, but talked himself out of it. This had been his decision, letting a stranger into his truck at midnight, and he felt implicated in his own near robbery in a way that made him not want to make that call. What he was concerned about was geography. He had ditched this man not far from his house. If the man had noticed the neighborhood, had any sense of where Charles lived, he could be there waiting. So, rather than going straight home, Charles drove around outside of town for about an hour, letting time pass, letting the situation settle. At the end of that hour, he came back into Harrington and turned onto his street. The man was right there, walking along the road in front of his house as if he had been waiting, as if he knew exactly where Charles lived. Charles hit the brakes without thinking, threw the truck into reverse, and got out of there. He called 911 from a payphone. An officer came to him and escorted him back to his property. The man was gone by the time they arrived. There was no sign of a break-in. No sign of anyone having been near the house. Charles felt the relief spread through him as he stood in his own yard, breathing cold air, grateful that what had been a terrifying night was over. He thanked the officer and then, almost as an afterthought, asked him a favor. His mother lived directly behind him, on the other side of a row of bushes at the back of his property. Dorothy, 70 years old, living alone. Charles asked if the officer wouldn't mind doing a quick check on her, just to confirm everything was okay on her side of the fence. The officer said, of course. He went across the backyard, through the bushes, into Dorothy's yard. The back window beside the door was shattered. The door itself was slightly open. The officer drew his weapon and went inside. Dorothy was upstairs. She had been stabbed to death. The man's name was Gilbert Cannon. After Charles drove away from him the second time, Gilbert had needed somewhere to sleep. He walked through the neighborhood and found a house that looked accessible. He broke in through the back door. Dorothy came down the stairs to confront the intruder. Gilbert was afraid she could identify him. He attacked her with the screwdriver he had been carrying all night. He had no idea that the house he had broken into belonged to the mother of the man he had tried to rob an hour earlier. The entire chain of events, the fast food restaurant, the late-night ride, the robbery attempt, the foot chase, the escape, the hour of driving around outside of town, the return to the neighborhood, the police escort home, and the discovery of Dorothy's body a matter of feet from where Charles was standing was, as Gilbert Cannon would later tell police, completely random. He didn't know Charles. He had picked the truck in the parking lot on impulse. After the robbery failed, he had picked the house on impulse. None of it was designed. There was no plan that threaded these two lives together. It just happened. Gilbert Cannon pleaded guilty to murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Charles Holden gave a stranger a partial ride home because he felt bad about saying no. And his mother paid for it. There is no framework that contains that. No way to resolve it into something meaningful or instructive or fair. Some things are not coincidences in the beautiful sense, they are collisions, accidents of proximity, two people arriving at the same terrible place through paths that had nothing to do with each other, except that they did. Except that Charles made a choice at a fast food counter at midnight. Except that Gilbert picked that truck and not a different one. If Charles had said no and meant it, if he hadn't felt that pull of guilt when the man turned and walked away, Gilbert never gets in that truck, never ends up in that neighborhood, never finds that house. Dorothy is alive the next morning. The distance between the ending this story had and the ending it might have had is one moment of second guessing. One small act of decency toward a stranger in a parking lot. 5 stories. A father and a daughter walking 100 feet apart, caught in the same photograph on the same afternoon in the same town where they were both searching for each other. A man who went to an audition as furniture and came home as Han Solo. A man who has been inside a plane crash, great white shark encounters, open ocean and a whale's mouth, and who keeps going back in the water because that's who he is. a sheriff who looked out a window at the right second and saved the wrong man, and a good Samaritan who gave someone a lift and lost his mother before the night was over. What connects them is not luck. Not exactly. What connects them is something harder to name: the fact that ordinary moments carry consequences that are wildly disproportionate to how they feel at the time. Michael Dick didn't know he was standing 100 feet from his daughter. Harrison Ford didn't know he was auditioning. Harold Bray didn't know what Alan Phillips had done 2 hours earlier. Charles Holden didn't know that the guilt he felt when a stranger turned and walked away would matter more than anything else that happened that night. They were just people in ordinary moments, making ordinary choices. And the universe arranged around those moments something enormous in one direction or another. The photograph finds you. The director notices. The ocean eventually lets you go. The flashlight gets seen. The stranger gets in. Most of the time, we will never know which of our ordinary moments carried the most weight. We don't get to see the photograph until it's already been taken. We don't find out about the open audition until we're already in the room. We can't know, standing in a fast food parking lot at midnight, watching someone walk away, whether the thing we're about to decide will change everything. We just make the call. And then we find out what it meant. Thank you for watching. If you want more stories like these, there are hundreds of them here on this channel. And if you want one recommendation from me, one video that's worth your time right now, it's this one right here. Until next time. On the afternoon of the 10th of June, 1871, a defense attorney named Clement Vallandigham was sitting inside a courtroom in Lebanon, Ohio. He was listening to a prosecutor question a witness on the stand. And with every single word this witness spoke, Clement could feel the knot in his stomach twist and tighten just a little bit more. This testimony was not just bad, it was devastating for Clement's client, a man named Thomas McGahan, who was on trial for murder. The murder itself had happened about 6 months earlier on a cold Christmas Eve in the nearby city of Hamilton. That night, McGahan had apparently stormed into a saloon with a group of his friends. Their target was another man inside named Tom Myers. An attack broke out, it was loud, it was chaotic, and in the middle of all the shouting and shoving, a single gunshot rang out. When the chaos finally died down, Tom Myers was on the floor, shot and killed. Now, the problem was, there were at least 30 other people in that saloon at the time. But the fight had happened so fast and it was so confusing that not a single person could say for sure that they saw who actually fired the gun. Despite this complete lack of a direct witness to the shooting, almost everyone in town immediately decided that Thomas McGahan had done it. And to be fair, even Clement had to admit that it was a reasonable assumption to make. You see, McGahan and the victim, Tom Myers, had a very long and very public history of not liking each other. It was a well-known feud, and everybody in town knew they hated each other. On top of that, McGahan had a reputation. He was known as a violent criminal, and there were rumors, whispers, that he had already killed at least 4 other men in his lifetime. So, when Tom Myers ended up dead after a fight with McGahan, the citizens of Hamilton didn't really feel the need to wait around for a trial. They were ready to form a mob and hang McGahan right then and there. Of course, the local police intervened before that could happen. They arrested McGahan and put him in jail to await trial. But the story of the saloon murder had already spread like wildfire all across Ohio. It was a messy, dramatic case with a notorious defendant, and as a result, the trial itself became a very high-profile event. Every single day, the courtroom was packed. Journalists from all over the state, important local figures, and curious members of the public all came to sit in the gallery and listen to the testimony unfold. And right now, all of these important people were sitting there watching Clement's defense case get absolutely obliterated by this one single witness. The witness on the stand was one of the men who had been in the saloon on the night of the murder. And he was making a very, very big claim. He was telling the court that even though nobody saw McGahan fire a gun, he was certain McGahan was the shooter. The witness said that right after the gunshot went off, he looked over and he saw a little puff of smoke coming out of McGahan's jacket pocket. The implication was clear. McGahan had his gun hidden inside his jacket, and he had fired it through the fabric to conceal the weapon. As the witness explained this theory, Clement looked around the courtroom. He saw people in the jury box nodding their heads. He saw journalists in the gallery scribbling furiously in their notepads. It was clear that everyone was buying it. What the witness said seemed to make perfect sense to them. At that point, Clement could tell that basically everyone in that room thought his client was guilty. But Clement did not agree. He knew his client's case looked terrible. He knew the public opinion was stacked against him. But Clement was absolutely certain deep down in his gut that Thomas McGahan was innocent. Clement had his own theory about what had happened that night in the saloon. He believed that the victim, Tom Myers, had actually shot himself by accident. He thought that during the chaotic brawl, Myers had tried to pull out his own gun to defend himself, but in the struggle he fumbled it and the gun went off, killing him. Unfortunately for Clement, this was 1,871. There was no advanced forensic science. There were no ballistics experts or gunshot residue tests. The only piece of physical evidence in the entire case was a few scorch marks on Tom Myers' shirt where the bullet had entered. So, the whole trial was really just based on what the witnesses said, and this particular witness was being very, very convincing for the prosecution. The prosecutor finished up his questioning with a confident flourish. He walked back to his table with a little smirk on his face, like he knew he had just landed the winning blow. He had pretty much just won the entire case with that one testimony. Now it was Clement's turn to cross-examine the witness. And honestly, he had no idea how it was going to go. He felt like he was facing a brick wall. But as Clement stood up from his chair and started to walk across the courtroom floor, a strange sense of calm came over him. He was thinking to himself, I really don't have that much to lose here. Pretty much everyone in this state already thinks my client is a murderer. So if he's found guilty, nobody is going to be shocked. But maybe, just maybe, I can find a way to prove he's innocent. And that would be a huge victory. And if I don't, well, it is what it is. To understand Clement's mindset, you have to know that he was a very controversial figure in Ohio at that time, which was right after the end of the Civil War. During the war, he had been a very vocal opponent of the president, Abraham Lincoln. His political viewpoints had actually gotten him banished from Ohio and the other northern states for a time. After the war ended, he was allowed to return to his home state of Ohio, and he went back to practicing law. But he had never really been able to fix his damaged public image. Even now, 6 years later, a lot of people in Ohio still really hated him for his behavior during the war. So in his mind, Clement knew that losing this case wasn't going to change much for him personally. Nothing would really change. He'd still be the guy that a lot of people disliked, and his client would be the convicted murderer everyone already thought he was. It is what it is. But if he won, if he could somehow pull off an acquittal in this impossible case, he could completely reinvent himself. He would no longer be the disgraced politician. He would be known as the sensational criminal defense lawyer who could overturn even the most hopeless cases. And again, he genuinely believed his client was innocent. So this would be a major victory on two fronts for Clement. It would be a professional triumph and a personal vindication. So, with this renewed sense of purpose, Clement stepped up to the witness box. He began firing off one question after another at the witness. By the end of the day, Clement had managed to get that witness to admit that he hadn't actually seen a physical gun in McGahan's hand or in his pocket. He had only seen the smoke. Then, Clement delivered his final blow to the prosecution's theory. He had the jacket that McGahan had been wearing that night brought into the court as evidence. He showed it to the judge and the jury, and he was able to prove that there was no hole anywhere on it. Not a single tear or burn mark. The jacket shooting theory was completely destroyed. As the week went on, more and more witnesses took the stand. Clement was pleased to find that none of them had any actual proof that McGahan had shot Tom Myers. But, on the other hand, he also couldn't find any solid evidence that proved his client was innocent either. He had poked holes in the prosecution's case, but he hadn't built a strong case of his own. So, later that week, on Friday, June 16th, as the trial was coming to a close, Clement was starting to get worried again. He knew that he had done a lot, but he also knew it probably wasn't enough to get his client acquitted. And even though he knew the odds were always stacked against him, he now felt like victory was possible. It was almost within his grasp, and now it felt like it was slipping through his fingers. That afternoon, Clement sat behind the defense table, sweating under his collar as he listened to the prosecutor's team deliver their closing arguments. And they were brutal. They painted McGahan as a cold-blooded killer and tore apart every little bit of doubt Clement had tried to create. This was giving Clement a lot of anxiety. He was just moments away from having to give his own closing arguments. This was his very last chance to convince the jury that his client was innocent. But he just did not feel like the speech he had prepared was going to be enough, especially not after the powerful and convincing speech the prosecutor was giving right now. And so, as the prosecutor eloquently wrapped up his speech, Clement was furiously crossing out lines on his own notes, trying to rewrite things, trying to make it better, stronger. But nothing was coming to him. He just sat there, racking his brain, trying to think of what to say. The prosecutor sat down, and the entire courtroom fell silent. Everybody was looking at Clement, waiting for him to stand up and deliver his closing argument. And as he sat there in that heavy silence, an idea suddenly hit him. It hit him so hard that he actually dropped his pen on the floor. He didn't know why this idea hadn't occurred to him earlier. It was so obvious. He suddenly realized there was a way he could definitively prove McGahan was innocent. And if he was right, he would go down in history as perhaps the greatest defense attorney Ohio had ever seen. Clement lunged for his pen again. He frantically started scribbling down the details of his new idea. A minute later, he heard the judge call his name, telling him it was his turn to speak. And so he shot to his feet and he cleared his throat. But instead of launching into the speech he had prepared for this moment, he did something unexpected. He asked the judge to let him deliver his closing argument on Monday instead. The judge was a little hesitant at first, but after some consideration, he agreed. And when he did, Clement felt a huge surge of excitement rush through his body. After the court proceedings officially ended for the day, Clement could not get out of that courthouse fast enough. He had a plan, and he needed to put it into motion. Clement waited until nightfall to act. He needed to run a test to make sure his theory, the one he was going to present on Monday, was correct. But he didn't want anyone from the prosecution team to see him doing it. So, after having dinner with some friends, Clement slipped out of his hotel and into the quiet, dark streets of Lebanon. While he was at dinner, he had been pretty vague about what he actually planned to do that night. But he did tell his friends that they really needed to stay in town long enough to hear his big final argument on Monday. He was that confident in what he was about to uncover. He was sure his speech on Monday would be one of the greatest legal moments in the history of Ohio. And so now, as Clement made his way to the edge of town, he was filled with adrenaline. He kept walking faster and faster until he was basically at a full run. And then he finally arrived at a quiet, isolated part of Lebanon. As soon as he got there, he set up for the test he had planned, and then he ran through it. After he finished, a wide smile spread across Clement's face. He knew, without a single doubt, that he had just found a way to prove that his client was innocent. Just a few minutes later, around 9 o'clock that evening, Clement was back inside of his hotel room. He was so excited about the results of his test that he couldn't even sit down. He just kept pacing back and forth around and around the small room, trying to get his thoughts in order, but he was just too excited. His hotel room door was cracked open, and as he was pacing, he saw his co-counsel, another lawyer on the defense team, walking by in the hallway. This hotel was sort of the home base for everyone who was in town for the trial. So most of the lawyers from both the prosecution and the defense teams were staying there. When Clement saw his co-counsel, he immediately waved him inside. He tried to tell him what he had figured out, but the words just kind of tumbled out in a jumbled mess. All he really managed to get across was that the prosecution had it all wrong, and that he, Clement, had figured out the truth. But his co-counsel was just looking at him with a confused expression, like he really didn't understand a word he was saying. And so, at some point, Clement realized that words weren't going to be enough. He needed to do a physical demonstration. He needed to repeat the test he had just done out in the field to actually show his co-counsel exactly what he was talking about. So, without much more explanation, Clement got up. He set up the test right there in the hotel room. He then turned to his co-counsel and told him to watch carefully. And then Clement began to perform the test. But this time, something went horribly wrong. During the demonstration, there was a sudden, loud explosion, and Clement collapsed to the ground. It would turn out that Clement's test did prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that his client really was innocent. His theory was that Tom Myers had shot himself by accident, by fumbling with his own gun. But in order to make sure his theory would hold up with the jury, he wanted to show everyone that it was definitely physically possible for that to happen. So, when Clement had gone to the edge of town to do the test by himself for the first time, he had taken a gun with him. He basically experimented with ways the accident could have happened. He shot the gun through pieces of fabric from different angles, and he looked at the resulting scorch marks. And when he did this, he realized that the scorch marks that had been left on the victim's clothes, which was the only forensic evidence they had, could have only been made if the victim was shot at point-blank range. This meant that Thomas McGahan, who was standing several feet away during the fight, was simply too far away to have been the shooter. But it was not until later, when Clement acted out the shooting again for his co-counsel in the hotel room, that his discovery went from great to perfect. Because completely by accident, he did exactly what he believed Tom Myers had done that night. He fumbled with the gun, and he shot himself. Clement died from his self-inflicted wound 12 hours later. But his death made his argument so powerful and so convincing that his client, Thomas McGahan, was eventually acquitted. So Clement had been right. This was the greatest case of his life. It was also his last. Our second and final story is about a song, but we're not going to be playing this song during the episode. And when you get to the end of this story, you'll see why. On an overcast, chilly Sunday in the fall of 1932, a 32-year-old composer named Rezo Scariest sat in his small apartment in Paris trying to write a new melody. He had been at it for hours and hours, and it was not going well at all. Each time he managed to jot down a new combination of notes, he would play it back, hate it, and then tear up the sheet of paper and toss it into his trash bin. The bin was already overflowing with a pile of other discarded drafts. Now, Rezo was used to this kind of messy, creative process. He had made a name for himself as a musician back in his home country of Hungary over the last decade. He had written more than 40 different musical compositions for various singers and artists, and a few of them had been really successful. So Rezo knew, deep down, that he had the talent to be a huge star. He believed he could change people's lives with his music. But recently, despite trying many different approaches and just letting the messy creative process happen, Rezo still could not come up with any new work that he felt was any good. A big part of the problem was that he was incredibly stressed out. At this point in 1932, Rezo and many other people were very nervous about the state of the world and what the future might hold. There were very violent and hateful political views that were spreading across Europe, especially in Germany. This was still 7 years before the official start of World War II, but Hitler and his Nazi party were already starting to gain a lot of power. And Rezo, who was Jewish, was deeply worried about all the anti-Jewish rhetoric that the Nazis were spreading. And while that was terrifying and kept him up at night, the more urgent day-to-day worry that was really blocking his creativity was a more practical one: how to literally afford to buy food. The world was also in the middle of the Great Depression, which was a period of time in the 1920s and 30s when multiple countries were dealing with terrible economies and massive unemployment. Back in Rezo's home country of Hungary, things were especially bad, and they were getting worse every day. Banks and businesses were closing down almost daily. More than a quarter of the entire population was unemployed and living in extreme poverty. Rezo had moved to Paris, hoping to find more opportunities. Paris, after all, was considered the art mecca of Europe. And even though the state of the world felt depressing and dark, Rezo thought that the creative energy in Paris would inspire him to create something beautiful in the middle of all the darkness. But now, as Rezo sighed and leaned back in his chair, he looked around his tiny, drafty Parisian apartment. He had been here for months, and his fortunes had certainly not changed. He still didn't have any work, and he still could not seem to write anything good. But Rezo, he kept trying. He would lean back over his piano and try to write, but almost immediately he would tear up the paper. He was just getting more and more frustrated with himself until finally he just gave up. He put his head in his hands and basically said out loud, "I can't do this." It seemed like the harder he worked and the harder he tried to ignore all the despair and sadness and the awful things that were going on in the world, the worse he felt. And obviously, the worse his work was. Right now, he actually almost felt physically sick from bottling up all of these terrible competing feelings and thoughts. But as he thought about the fact that he was bottling everything up, he suddenly decided he just couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't continue to keep all of that stuff locked inside. And it was at that exact moment that Rezo took a deep breath and he let in all of the anguish that he had been trying so hard to push away. Sadness and fear and a quiet sense of desperation just washed over him and into him. And this time, he didn't fight it. He just let it happen. And then suddenly, he started writing. His pen flew across the page as wave after wave of these terrible emotions hit him. When he was done, he ran over to his piano to play the notes that he had just written down. And as his fingers moved across the keys, a very slow, very sad melody began to fill the small room. It was so beautiful and so incredibly sad that he actually felt like he was going to cry just from hearing it himself. When he was done playing, he just sat back in his chair. And now, tears were filling his eyes, and his heart was pounding so fast that he knew he needed to get some fresh air, and fast, or he might actually just pass out. And so Rezo went outside to take a walk. He hoped the fresh air would help him snap out of the wild emotional fog that had just come over him. But the Paris streets were gray and cold, and this new melody just continued to ring in his ears. He was thrilled that he had actually written something real and powerful for the first time in what felt like a very long time. But it was such an intense expression of his own personal sadness that it almost hurt to have created it. Shortly into his walk, he heard somebody call his name. When he looked up, he saw it was his good friend, a poet named Yo Yavor, who was rushing right up to him. And right away, when Rezo saw his friend, he felt himself lightening up just a little bit. He liked Laszlo. They were both Hungarians living in Paris, trying to make good art and make a name for themselves, but neither of them had really succeeded yet. But as soon as Laszlo reached him, Rezo could tell that his friend seemed really upset about something too. His friend told him that his fiancée had just ended their engagement, and he was completely heartbroken. After Rezo said that he was terribly sorry to hear that, the two men just walked together in silence for a while. They were both lost in their own sad, heavy feelings, and neither of them could think of anything to say. And then, without even meaning to, Rezo just began to whistle the song that he had just written. And when he did this, it was like the tune had an immediate effect on Laszlo. His friend's eyes welled up with tears, and he sort of began to cry. And also, he began to sing along to the melody using words from a very sad poem that he himself had recently written. Rezo couldn't believe it. Without even trying, Laszlo's words were a perfect fit for his melody. And as this sort of impromptu collaboration began, the two men went from this really dark, gloomy mood to a purely excited one. They were so inspired that they rushed into a nearby restaurant to sit down and work out the rest of the song. Before they knew it, Rezo had written an entire composition with Laszlo's lyrics. The song was about someone whose lover had just died, and their deep desire to be reunited with them in the afterlife, Pakis. When the men finished, they wanted to hear their new song out loud. So they asked the restaurant's resident musicians if they would play it for them. And pretty soon, their song, something that hadn't even existed just a few hours ago, was being played throughout the crowded restaurant. And as far as Rezo and Laszlo could tell, everybody inside was loving this song. Some of the restaurant patrons actually started to cry. Others closed their eyes and just kind of swayed to the sad sound. It was exactly what Rezo had always hoped his music would do, which was to truly and deeply affect those who heard it. Rezo and Laszlo looked at each other, and for the first time in days, they both smiled. Rezo and Laszlo decided to call their song Gloomy Sunday since it had been created on that hazy fall Sunday. They both had a feeling that this particular tune was very special, and that it would finally be the thing that changed both of their lives for the better. So, over the next few months, they took the song around to different music producers and tried to get somebody to buy it. And finally, someone did. A company agreed to publish the sheet music and to record the song. After that, Rezo went back to his shabby Parisian apartment, and he waited. He waited for the song to take hold, for it to become a hit, and for the money to start pouring in. But that is not what happened. As the months passed by, Rezo didn't hear Gloomy Sunday on the radio. He didn't see it on any music charts. He didn't hear it in other restaurants or being performed in theaters. It was like the song had never even existed at all. And this completely crushed Rezo. He was even more upset and defeated than he had been before he had written it, because now he had gotten a taste of hope. And it felt so much worse to fail after that. The rest of Rezo's life, and the state of the world, got worse too. The Great Depression was still going strong. And as Hitler got more and more popular, people started to wonder if there was going to be a major war. So Rezo and pretty much everyone else around him just sank further and further into their fears and worries and kept praying for something, anything, to change. 3 years later, on a spring evening in 1935, Rezo was back in Hungary. He was walking down a street in the country's capital city, Budapest. He was on his way to a friend's house. But as he strolled down the sidewalk, he heard a song coming from an open window of a nearby apartment. He stopped cold in his tracks, and his heart began to pound in his chest, because he knew that song. It was his. It was Gloomy Sunday. Rezo had no idea how or why he was hearing his song. As far as he knew, no one had really been that interested in it. But it was completely shocking. Someone he didn't know was listening to his song on the radio. That meant it was being put out on the airwaves, that it was being consumed by the public. This was incredible. And so Rezo just stood there on the sidewalk, letting his own notes wash over him, hearing it out in public for the very first time. And when the song was done, he just stood there for another moment and just absolutely beamed with joy. After that day, for months, Gloomy Sunday was everywhere. Rezo heard it being played at social gatherings. He heard it streaming from people's windows. Street performers sang it to people passing by, and it was even performed at big concert venues all over the city. And so by the end of that year, it seemed like there was hardly anyone in all of Hungary who hadn't heard and loved his song. Rezo even read in the newspapers that his song was being played in England, in France, and as far away as the United States. So Rezo knew that he had actually done it. He had finally realized his dream of being a successful, internationally recognized composer with a hit song that truly resonated with the public. A few months later, on a morning in late February of 1936, Rezo left his apartment and was heading out for the day. And on his way down the street, he passed by a newsstand. He happened to notice that one of the headlines mentioned his song Gloomy Sunday. Initially, he was really excited to see that he was getting some press coverage. So, he immediately grabbed a copy of the newspaper and opened it up to read the article. But as his eyes scanned the page, his stomach completely flipped. Because this was not good press. In fact, what this article had to say was so terrible that Rezo's first reaction was that he must have read it wrong. And so, he read it again, and then a third time, and then a fourth time. But each time he read it, it just said the same horrible thing. and so Rezo found himself starting to panic. He quickly shut the paper and just began looking around him. He saw there were a few other people who were also standing by the newsstand, and they were reading the same paper. And they were all talking to one another in hushed, worried voices and pointing at that same headline about his song. And Rezo just stood there, listening to this unsettling murmur and feeling a wave of absolute horror wash over him. Over the next month, more and more headlines about Rezo's song continued to appear in the papers. And it was like each day, they only got worse. And then the story went international. The Catholic Church weighed in on it. And then the police got involved. Finally, one afternoon at the end of March in 1936, Rezo was sitting at his piano, just staring down at the keys. He knew he should be writing music, but instead he was just filled with a sense of dread, just like he had been every single day since he first read that dreadful headline. And then suddenly, there was a sharp knock at his door. And when Rezo got up and answered it, a cold sweat broke out all over his body because it was the Budapest police. And they wanted him to come down to the station with them. Rezo's pulse raced with nerves. But at this point, he wasn't really surprised. Because by now, he knew that writing Gloomy Sunday had been a horrific, terrible mistake. Because it would turn out, Gloomy Sunday had been a very shockingly impactful song, just as Rezo had thought he wanted it to be. But over the course of the last year, the police had begun finding its sheet music, or its written lyrics, or the actual song playing on record players at the scenes of suicides. Dozens and dozens of people across Hungary, across Europe, and in the United States, from police officers to teenagers to waitstaff to students, had taken their own lives, basically while listening to Gloomy Sunday. These deaths became so widespread that a Hungarian archbishop actually wrote a public letter to the people begging them to stop hurting themselves. And multiple official bans of the song itself were enacted across Europe and England and the United States. On the day that the Budapest police knocked on Rezo's door, they demanded that he stop all sales of the song. And Rezo immediately agreed. And eventually, so did the song's publisher and his musical partner, Laszlo. And Rezo's partner, Laszlo, was especially grief-stricken by this whole thing. Because his fiancée, the one who had broken his heart on the very day he had written the song with Rezo, she ended up being one of the many suicide victims. Before she took her own life, she sent Laszlo a telegram which simply said, "Gloomy Sunday." No one knows for sure why Gloomy Sunday potentially caused this sudden wave of death. One theory is that people were already really suffering from depression and feeling hopeless because of the Great Depression and the worsening political climate. And the song's popularity was either a terrible coincidence or it served as a sort of unfortunate trigger for those who were already on the edge. As for Rezo, he was devastated by the dark legacy of his song. Even though it did technically live up to his original vision, it did deeply resonate with people and was unquestionably a hit. It was a nightmare. Over the years, despite all the negative associations with the song, it's been translated into 28 different languages and was even performed by legendary singers like Frank Sinatra and Billie Holiday. Initially, there was an estimated 20 suicides attributed to Gloomy Sunday across Europe and the United States. In the years that have followed, however, the lore around the song has only grown, and some estimates now put the death toll in the hundreds. Although these numbers are very difficult to verify, Rezo never wrote another hit song. And in fact, ultimately, he followed in the footsteps of some of his listeners. He jumped out of the window of his 8th floor apartment on another overcast, gloomy Sunday, and he died 2 days later. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the afternoon of the 10th of April, 1998, a 40-year-old woman named Diane Auget stood at a bar inside the Hayloft Tavern. It was a small local spot in Hudson, Florida. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, or at least they think they do. Diane held a glass in her hand. She brought it to her lips and downed the last few sips of her drink. Her vision was starting to get blurry, and a wave of nausea rolled through her stomach. But she didn't care. In fact, that was kind of the point. She yelled out to the bartender, her voice slurred and thick, telling him to bring her another round. She wanted to get so drunk that she could forget everything. Because right then, her life felt like a complete disaster. It hadn't always been this way. Not too long ago, Diane had been a married stay-at-home mother. She had 3 kids, and they were her entire world. She loved them more than anything. But about 10 years before this night at the bar, her life had taken a very difficult turn. She started having very serious mental health problems. After a long and difficult process, she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. It was a heavy diagnosis, one that came with a whole new set of challenges. She would fall into these deep, dark depressions. They were so powerful, they would make it almost impossible for her to function, to even get out of bed in the morning. Then, like a switch would flip, she would swing into these intense manic episodes. These would keep her awake for days on end, leaving her so delirious and exhausted that she would start talking to herself, seeing things that weren't there. Living with this was incredibly hard, not just for Diane, but for her family. Eventually, the strain became too much. Her husband divorced her, and in the custody battle that followed, he was awarded full custody of their children. Losing her kids, even if she understood why, was a blow that Diane never fully recovered from. By 1998, her life had sort of leveled off into a new, difficult normal. She was living with her sister, which provided some support and a roof over her head. But her bipolar disorder was far from under control. She had medication for it, but she wasn't always consistent about taking it. So, the cycles continued. The crushing lows of depression, followed by the chaotic highs of mania. She had been in and out of various psychiatric facilities more times than her family could count. Each time, they hoped it would be the one that finally helped her find stability. But it never seemed to stick. So, on this particular night, April 10th, Diane was in a dark place. She just wanted to numb the pain, to drown her sorrows, and make the world go quiet for a little while. A couple of hours earlier, she had left her sister's house. She didn't say where she was going. She didn't own a car, so she just started walking. Her feet eventually carried her to the Hayloft Tavern. And for the past couple of hours, she had been standing there, mostly by herself, pacing in circles and drinking alone. Just then, the bartender came back over to her side of the bar. Diane was seeing double, but she could clearly see that he wasn't carrying another drink for her. His hands were empty. He had a look on his face that was half annoyed, half sympathetic. He told her he was cutting her off, that she'd had enough. Diane was furious. The feeling of humiliation washed over her. She started to argue with him, telling him he didn't know what he was talking about, that she was fine, but the bartender just held up his hands and stood his ground. He was sorry, he said, but she was cut off. There was a finality in his voice. Defeated and angry, Diane turned and stumbled out of the bar, disappearing into the Florida night. The next day, April 11th, Diane's mother, Mildred, was pacing back and forth inside her living room. She held a phone pressed tightly to her ear, listening to it ring. After a couple of rings, a dispatcher from the local police department answered. In a shaky voice, Mildred told them she needed to report her daughter, Diane, as a missing person. A little while earlier, Mildred had gotten a call from her other daughter, the one Diane was living with. She said that Diane had left the house the night before and still hadn't come home. She hadn't called, hadn't left a note, nothing. Given Diane's history of mental illness and her often erratic behavior, Mildred's mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. She felt a deep, cold pit of fear in her stomach. Her daughter had to be in some kind of trouble. On the phone with the police dispatcher, Mildred explained the whole situation. She said that yes, it was possible that Diane had just left on her own for some reason. But it was just as possible, if not more so, that she was having a manic episode. When that happened, Diane could become disoriented. She might have wandered off and gotten lost, with no idea how to get back home. The dispatcher was calm and professional. She assured Mildred that she would send officers to interview her and her other daughter right away. They would start looking for Diane immediately. But 4 days went by. 4 long, agonizing days. And on April 15th, there was still no sign of Diane. That afternoon, Mildred went down to the police station. It was a trip she had made every single day since her daughter had disappeared, hoping for any scrap of news. But just like all the other days, the police didn't have any new information for her. They told her what little they knew, which wasn't much. They had confirmed that on the night of April 10th, after leaving her sister's house, Diane had gone to the Hayloft Tavern. They spoke to the bartender, who confirmed he had cut her off because she was incredibly drunk. He said she had walked out of the bar, and that was the last he saw of her. Investigators had also found a couple of people who had seen Diane the following day, on April 11th. She had been sighted walking along Highway 19, which was just a couple of miles away from the tavern. Another witness spotted her near a locally owned motel right off the highway, a place called the Coral Sands Motel. But after that, the trail went cold. The police told Mildred they had no idea what happened to Diane after that. They didn't know where she could have gone or what could have happened to her. Mildred left the police station feeling a profound sense of disappointment and fear. The drive home was a blur. Her mind was racing, playing out all the terrible possibilities. Was her daughter hiding somewhere on purpose? Had she gotten lost and was now hurt, hungry, and alone? Or had she run into the wrong person? Had she been kidnapped? Or worse? These scenarios tormented her, each one more terrifying than the last. Finally, she pulled into her driveway and went inside. She sat down on her couch, exhausted, and tried to think about what she could possibly do next. And that's when she noticed it. The little red light on her answering machine was blinking. She had a new voicemail. Mildred thought maybe it was her other daughter, calling with an update while she was out. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something to do with Diane. She got up, walked over to the machine, and pressed the play button. What she heard next made her blood run cold. It was Diane's voice, and she sounded absolutely terrified. Through the static of the machine, Mildred could hear her daughter crying out, "Help. Let me out." Then there was a scuffling sound on the recording, like someone had grabbed the phone away from Diane. Mildred heard Diane say something like, "Hey, give me that," and then the call just cut off. The line went dead. After hearing the message, Mildred went into a total panic. Her worst fears were no longer just possibilities in her head. They felt real. It sounded like her daughter was in terrible immediate danger. Shaking with anxiety and fear, she grabbed the answering machine and looked at the small display for the caller ID, desperate to see who had left this horrifying message. But all it said was that the call had come in from a place called Starlight. The name meant nothing to Mildred. She quickly dialed the number back, her heart pounding in her chest, praying that someone would pick up. But no one answered. The phone just rang and rang. With trembling hands, Mildred called the police. This voicemail changed everything. It was now obvious to the police that Diane hadn't just left on purpose, and she wasn't just lost. Based on that recording, it sounded like she had been kidnapped and was being held somewhere against her will. But the question was, where? The police had no idea. They tried to trace the call, but they couldn't pinpoint a specific location. And they couldn't figure out what Starlight was either. Was it a business? A nickname for a location? They had no leads. So, for another full day, despite this terrifying new clue, the investigation stalled. There just wasn't much to go on. That is, until the next afternoon. On April 16th, 5 days after Diane had disappeared, the police got a call. It was from a man who said he had just been walking along the side of Highway 19. He told the dispatcher he had found something disturbing lying in the grass. He said he wasn't even sure if the object was real, but it looked so troubling that he thought the police should come and check it out, just in case. Police immediately rushed out to the location. They met the man, who showed them what he had found. The officers carefully collected the object and sent it off to the crime lab for testing. Then they waited. When the analysis came back, they learned two things. First, the object was definitely real. And second, it belonged to Diane Augat. It was the severed tip of her finger from her right hand. Over the next few years, the case of Diane Auget grew colder but stranger. People would occasionally call in sightings of her to the police in Florida. Investigators looked into every single tip. They interviewed more than 100 people, chasing down every possible lead. But nothing ever panned out. The police never figured out what Starlight was, the mysterious place where that desperate voicemail had originated. And they never determined how or why Diane's finger was cut off and left by the side of the highway. But despite the lack of answers, strange clues that were definitely tied to Diane kept turning up in the most bizarre places. For example, the manager of a convenience store near where Diane lived found a plastic bag inside their store's outdoor freezer. Inside the bag were Diane's clothes, all neatly folded. Who would put them there and why? Another time, a customer at a different nearby convenience store found another plastic bag that had been left behind on a countertop. This bag was full of toiletries, including eyeliner, perfume, and lipstick. And on the outside of the bag, scrawled in marker, was the name Diane. Police were never able to figure out who placed either of the bags or what they were supposed to mean. Unfortunately, today, more than 2 decades later, Diane's case remains unsolved. Her family has never stopped looking for answers. Around 3:30 the afternoon on the 17th of December, 1927, a 21-year-old sailor named Joe Stevens stood inside a U.S. Navy submarine. The vessel was cruising silently underwater in Cape Cod Bay, about a mile off the coast of Massachusetts. Joe was at the very front of the submarine, stationed inside a small, windowless compartment known as the torpedo room. It was about 20 feet long and 10 feet wide. On one side, a heavy metal door stood open, leading out to the rest of the sub. The walls of the room were lined with 6 bunks for the crew, a tangled mess of machinery, and several long, menacing torpedoes. Despite the cramped and dark conditions, Joe was absolutely thrilled to be there. Working on a submarine had been his dream for as long as he could remember. When he was just a little kid, he had actually built his own periscope out of a piece of wood. A periscope on a real submarine is like a long set of binoculars that can be raised up from the sub. It allows the crew to be just below the surface of the water, hidden from view, while the periscope pokes just barely out of the water to see what's going on around them. With this fake wooden periscope, Joe and his older sister, Florence, would spend hours and hours pretending they were on a submarine deep underwater, going on all sorts of secret and important missions. So, years later, when Joe turned 18, remember, the very first thing he did was enlist in the Navy. And just recently, he had finally been assigned to work on this exact submarine. For Joe, it was literally his childhood dream coming true. On this particular day, Joe was taking part in one of his very first test sails. The mission was simple. He and the other 40 men on board were just running through drills, testing all the different machinery to make sure everything was in perfect working order. Joe and 5 other men had been assigned to the torpedo room. They were standing by, waiting for a command from their captain to come through on the one-way intercom system overhead. But as they were standing there, waiting in the quiet hum of the submarine, something happened. Out of nowhere, Joe heard a loud, grating, metallic sound. It echoed through the entire submarine, a horrible screech of metal against metal. The sub itself shook so violently from the impact that Joe and the other men were thrown off their feet, falling hard to the metal floor. Immediately, Joe and his coworkers scrambled to get up. They looked at each other with wide, confused eyes, all thinking the same thing. What was that? But before they could even say a word, their worst nightmare began to unfold. A torrent of seawater began to rush through that open door, flooding in from the rest of the submarine and into the torpedo room. As this absolutely horrifying scenario was playing out, Joe's immediate reaction was a strange and overwhelming sense of déjà vu. For just a split second, he felt like he had experienced this exact moment before. But before he could even process that bizarre feeling, a couple of his coworkers rushed past him. They managed to get to the door that connected the torpedo room to the rest of the submarine, and with all their strength, they slammed it shut and sealed it tight. At that point, Joe was snapped back to reality. He wasn't thinking about the feeling of déjà vu anymore. He was focused on what was happening. He realized there must have been some kind of terrible accident. Everyone in the room thought the same thing. That horrible grating sound, the shaking, the rushing water, it could only mean one thing. Something had struck their submarine. He expected to hear the captain's voice come over the intercom at any second, not to continue the test run, but with urgent orders about what they should do now that a real-world emergency was happening. And so, for a couple of minutes, Joe and his 5 fellow sailors just sat there in the now sealed-off torpedo room, waiting in silence for that announcement. But there was nothing. Just the sound of their own breathing and the faint creaks of the submarine. And then they all felt a final, heavy jolt, as if the entire submarine had just settled at the bottom of the bay. At first, Joe and the 5 other sailors didn't panic. They knew that whatever had happened was not good. It was serious. But they figured it wasn't a total catastrophe just yet. It was bad, but maybe they could be saved. After all, they were only about a mile away from the nearest Coast Guard station. And even though Joe and the others inside the torpedo room had no way to communicate with the outside world from where they were, they assumed that someone in the other parts of the submarine would be able to send out a distress call to the Coast Guard. They figured help was already on its way. But the minutes slowly turned into hours. And there was no progress. There was no sign that any sort of rescue was underway. They heard nothing over the intercom. They couldn't even hear any sounds from the other side of the sealed door. They thought that by now, surely one of their comrades would have come over and knocked or tried to talk to them in some way. But there was only silence. To make matters worse, the emergency lights inside the torpedo room eventually flickered and died, plunging them into total darkness. They were trapped at the bottom of the bay in a sealed metal room with no light. They also had no food and no water. All the supplies were in the other part of the submarine, but they couldn't risk opening the door. More water could come rushing in. They were completely and utterly trapped. All of that was horrible, but the scariest part of the whole situation was something they all knew but didn't want to say out loud. There was a finite amount of oxygen inside that sealed room. And with every single breath they took, they were using up that precious air supply. Pretty soon, that tiny metal torpedo room started to feel less like a part of a submarine and more like an underwater coffin. Joe began fading in and out of sleep. He lost all track of time in the endless dark. And with each passing hour, he was starting to lose hope. But then, suddenly, Joe heard a sound. It was a loud, metallic, clanging sound. He realized someone was knocking on the outside of the submarine. Their rescue had begun. Joe and the others immediately jumped out of their bunks, knocking into each other in the pitch-black room. They scrambled over to the hull of the sub and began knocking back, signaling to whoever was out there that they were alive. They were still in there. By using Morse code, which is a method of communication that uses a series of taps, Joe was able to have a conversation with the people outside. He confirmed that they were Coast Guard rescue divers. And they told Joe what had happened. They explained that about 16 hours earlier, a Coast Guard ship had accidentally struck their submarine. The collision had punctured the hull, and the submarine had sunk to the bottom. Everyone else on board, besides Joe and the 5 men with him in the torpedo room, had drowned. When Joe and the others heard this news, it was horrifying. But at the same time, they were hit with a wave of relief. Had they not sealed that door as fast as they did, they would be dead too. They were so incredibly lucky to be alive. So, after hearing this message, Joe began frantically knocking back a new message. He basically said, well, that's great, but when are you going to get us out of here? He explained that they were running out of air, that it was getting harder and harder to breathe. But the rescue divers could only tell him that they were doing their best. They would get them up as soon as they possibly could. And this was true. The Coast Guard was genuinely doing everything they could to save them. But the reality was, this was a really, really difficult problem. You have 6 people trapped inside a small air pocket deep underwater. If you try to open any part of the submarine, the immense pressure of the ocean would cause water to rush in so quickly that it would kill everyone inside instantly. So that wasn't an option. You also had the ticking clock. As Joe had said, they were running out of air. This meant there was a very compressed timeline to figure this out. So really, the only option was to somehow lift the entire submarine with everyone still inside and raise it to the surface. But this was 1927. This would be a complicated thing to do even with modern technology, let alone nearly 100 years ago. But it was their best and only chance. The plan was to bring in multiple ships with different kinds of heavy-duty lifts and somehow scoop up the submarine and bring it to the surface before everyone inside suffocated. But there was another problem. Just as they began to organize all these ships, a huge storm rolled in. The surface of the ocean was now being battered by extremely high winds, making it nearly impossible to position the ships and their lifting equipment. And unfortunately, the weather forecast said this storm was going to rage for days. While this catastrophe was playing out off the coast of Massachusetts, about 100 miles away in Providence, Rhode Island, Joe's older sister, Florence, opened up a newspaper. She read yet another article about the sunken submarine where she knew her little brother was trapped. For the last couple of days, Florence had been absolutely glued to her radio and the newspapers, desperate for any piece of good news. But every article, every news segment, said the same thing. The 6 men trapped inside the sub were still alive. They were communicating with the divers. But the storm on the surface was still too intense to rescue them. Florence felt so scared for her brother, and it wasn't just because the situation itself was so dangerous. It was because she remembered the submarine game that she and Joe used to play when they were little. More specifically, she remembered the very last time they ever played it. Joe had been about 4 years old. The two of them had just finished another one of their make-believe missions, and they were supposed to be bringing their imaginary submarine back up to the surface. But then, Joe had suddenly dropped his homemade wooden periscope. He turned to Florence and said something so strange and so haunting for such a young child that Florence had never forgotten it. She had asked him to explain what he meant, but he had refused. In fact, after that day, he refused to play the submarine game ever again. Now, Florence hadn't thought about that strange moment in years. But now, seeing what was happening to her brother, it was all she could think about. A couple of days later, on December 22nd, 5 days after the submarine had sunk, Florence received the official word. Her brother Joe and all the other sailors trapped in the torpedo room had died while waiting to be rescued. Florence was completely grief-stricken. This was her baby brother, and he had just died in this horrible, drawn-out way. But also, strangely, for the first time in her life, she felt like she actually understood what Joe had said all those years ago when he was just 4 years old when they had played that last game of submarine. On that day, after dropping his periscope, he had turned to Florence and said, quote, "All hands were lost." It's an expression used in the Navy to mean that everybody on board a ship has died. He was saying their make-believe submarine had just sunk, and everyone on board had died. And remember, after he said this, Florence had tried to get 4-year-old Joe to explain, but he wouldn't. And he never played the game again. So now, in hindsight, Florence believed that her 4-year-old brother, all those years ago, had somehow predicted his own death. On the evening of the 19th of April, 1989, a 62-year-old man named Thomas Meehan was sitting in his living room in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was relaxing, watching some television, when his phone rang. Thomas picked it up and said hello. He heard the voice of his daughter Patricia on the other end of the line. And right away he could tell from the tone of her voice that she was feeling really down. This didn't really surprise him. Patricia was 37 years old, and Thomas knew she had been struggling a lot lately. She lived almost 2,000 miles away from him in Bozeman, Montana, where she worked as a ranch hand. She liked her job, for the most part, mainly because she absolutely loved animals. but she had a really hard time getting along with people. She was lonely. She didn't have a lot of close friends. On top of that, she had recently been through a tough breakup. And even though she had always wanted kids, she had never had any of her own. To her father, it seemed like his daughter was going through a classic midlife crisis. So, as Thomas was on the phone, listening to his daughter make small talk about her life, he decided to cut through it. He just asked her, "Hey, what's going on? How are you really doing?" Patricia paused for a moment. Then, she vaguely said that she was just under a lot of stress. She told him she was thinking about quitting her job and moving away from Bozeman. She then asked her dad if he would be okay with her coming to Pittsburgh, maybe moving back in with him for a while. Thomas adored his daughter, and he felt for everything she was going through. So, without a moment's hesitation, he told her, of course. Of course she could come home anytime she wanted. Hearing this definitely seemed to lighten Patricia's mood. She told her dad that she would call him back the next day to make more solid plans. And then she said she loved him, and she hung up the phone. But the next day, Thomas did not get a call from Patricia. In fact, he never got another call from his daughter ever again. The following day, April 20th, at about 8:15 inches the evening, something strange happened 1,500 miles away from Thomas's house in Pittsburgh. A woman named Carol Heights was driving down a very isolated two-lane highway in the rural town of Circle, Montana. It was dark and cold outside. The only thing Carol could see was the red taillights of the one car driving in front of her. Beyond that, on either side of the highway, there was just big, empty fields stretching out into the darkness. But then, out of nowhere, the car in front of her, which had been driving along at a steady speed, suddenly swerved off the road. For a second, Carol was just confused. Why would they do that? What caused that car to suddenly veer out of the way? But then, a split second later, Carol understood exactly what had happened. Because right in front of her, in her lane, was another car driving the wrong way, barreling straight towards her. Carol jammed on her brakes and tried to swerve out of the way, just like the car in front of her had done. But she wasn't fast enough. The other car smashed into her, basically head-on. Carol felt her head snap back against the seat. There was a deafening, metallic crunching sound, and then everything went black. Just a couple of minutes later, Carol opened her eyes. She realized she had survived the crash. She felt a sharp pain in her neck, and her car was a complete mess. The airbags had deployed. It was obvious she'd been in a very serious wreck, but she was alive. Eventually, Carol managed to push her door open and climb out of the car. Her first thought was to check on the other driver. The other car was smashed right up against hers, and she couldn't see if the person inside was okay. So she got out and started walking over to the other vehicle. But before she could reach it, the driver of the other car also climbed out. In the combined glare of both cars' headlights, Carol could see that the other person was a middle-aged woman. She appeared to have shoulder-length strawberry blonde hair. And this woman, she didn't seem to be hurt, at least not visibly. In fact, what was really weird was that she seemed very, very calm. This woman just stood there by her wrecked car, not saying a single word to Carol. She didn't acknowledge what she had just done, which was drive the wrong way down a highway and smash head-on into Carol's car, nearly killing her. There was no recognition of that at all. Instead, she just stood there. And then, eventually, she turned and just stared directly at Carol. This was starting to get very alarming for Carol. It caused her to stop in her tracks and just stand there as well, staring back at this woman, not really sure what to do or say. And as Carol was waiting to see what would happen next, the other driver, this middle-aged woman, simply turned and started walking away. At this point, Carol yelled out to her to stop. She shouted that she couldn't go, that they had just been in a horrible accident, and they had to wait for the police to get there. She couldn't just leave the scene. But the woman didn't even look back. She just calmly walked off the highway, climbed over a wire fence into one of those big empty fields on the side of the road, and just kept on walking until Carol couldn't see her anymore. She had just vanished into the darkness. When the police arrived about 45 minutes later at 9 p.m., they found the two wrecked cars and a very shaken Carol. The other driver, as Carol explained, was gone. So, the police ran the license plate of the car that had hit Carol's. They learned that it was registered to a 37-year-old woman named Patricia Meehan. But beyond the fact that Patricia had apparently just walked away from the crash, the other weird thing was that the registration showed she lived 400 miles away. The police had no idea what she was even doing all the way out here in Circle, Montana. Patricia did not come back to the crash site. So eventually, the police called in K9 units and they began searching for her. The dogs were able to pick up her trail. They found a line of her footprints leading out into that dark field. They followed that trail for hours and hours, deep into the empty landscape. But eventually, the footprints just stopped, and the dogs lost her scent. The police would continue looking for her, but they never found another trace of Patricia. It really was like she had just wandered into that field and vanished into thin air. But that was not the end of the story. About 2 weeks later, a totally unrelated police officer was eating at a fast food restaurant in Luverne, Minnesota. This was about 700 miles away from the crash site. Now, even though this officer lived and worked in a completely different state, he had actually heard about Patricia Meehan's disappearance. He'd seen pictures of her, because by this point, her case had become national news. So, when this officer looked across the restaurant he was in and saw a middle-aged woman with strawberry blonde hair sitting in a booth all by herself, silently drinking a glass of water and just staring off into space, he immediately thought it was Patricia. The police officer had no idea if this really was her. He was pretty confident it was, but it just seemed so random and so bizarre that she would be here, of all places. He also didn't know if she was alone or what she was doing. So, instead of getting up and talking to her, he decided to just stay in his seat and keep an eye on her. And for the next 5 hours, the woman he believed was Patricia just sat there in the booth. She slowly drank water and stared off into space for 5 straight hours. Eventually, the restaurant closed for the night. An employee had to go over and tell the woman that she had to leave. They also told the officer that he too had to go. So after the officer and the woman he thought was Patricia had left the restaurant, the officer kind of hung back and continued to watch her. And she just walked right across the street and went into a diner that was open all night. This time, the officer did not keep his distance. He went inside the diner, walked right over to where she was sitting at a table, and he sat down next to her. He just said, "What's your name?" For a moment, the woman seemed kind of confused, like she couldn't understand why a random police officer was sitting with her. But instead of challenging him, she just went quiet for a second. And then, in a sort of hushed voice, she said that she was from Colorado. But then a moment later, she shook her head and said, "Actually, no. I'm from Israel." And before she could give up any more information, like her name or why she was there, she suddenly jumped up out of her seat and ran outside. The police officer was caught off guard. He was a little slow to get up and chase after her. He ran outside too, but by the time he got out there, she had disappeared again. Over the next month or so, the police in charge of Patricia's case received dozens of reports just like this one. They came from people who believed they had seen Patricia at restaurants and truck stops all over America. And the police actually confirmed many of these sightings. They believed that these witnesses really did see Patricia, that it wasn't just some look-alike. And in every single case, the witnesses reported the same thing. This woman, presumably Patricia, refused to speak and was just staring vacantly into space. She didn't seem to know who she was or what she was even doing. But also, in every one of these cases, before anybody could intervene or ask her questions or just try to help her in some way, Patricia would run off and disappear again. It was like Patricia was a ghost, appearing and disappearing over and over again all across the country. As of today, there have been over 5,000 reported sightings of Patricia Meehan. But still, we do not know where she is. Her case, to this day, is still open and unsolved. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.